Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on an extraordinary journey through one of England's most dramatic and bloody chapters, the Wars of the Roses, a 30-year family feud that tore apart the very heart of medieval England from 1455 to 1487. We'll softly explore the passionate love stories, bitter betrayals, and epic battles between the noble houses of York and Lancaster, from the tragic madness of King Henry VI to the fierce determination of Margaret of Anjou, the she-wolf of France, and finally to the romantic triumph of Henry Tudor and Elizabeth of York, whose love united a divided kingdom. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, I'd love to hear from you wonderful viewers. Please share in the comments which royal figure from tonight's story intrigued you most. Was it the warrior Queen Margaret, the ambitious Richard III, or perhaps the unlikely hero Henry Tudor? Your thoughts always make my day brighter. And if you're enjoying these soothing historical tales, a gentle like and subscribe would mean the world to me. It helps bring these stories to more dreamers like yourself. So cozy up under your favorite blanket, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from medieval England lull you into the most restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to our growing Sleepy Crown family. Now, let our story begin in the misty halls of medieval England, where roses bloomed red with blood and white with tears. Henry, later known as King Henry VI of England, entered this world on a cold December day in 1421 at Windsor Castle, destined to inherit not one but two crowns, those of England and France. Yet fate would prove cruelly ironic, for this infant prince would grow to lose both kingdoms and witness his realm tear itself apart in the bloodiest civil war England had ever known. The roots of this devastating conflict stretched back generations, like ancient oak trees whose twisted branches would eventually strangle the very ground from which they grew. To understand the Wars of the Roses, we must first journey back to the golden reign of Edward III, who ruled England from 1327 to 1377, a monarch whose numerous sons would unknowingly plant the seeds of future destruction. Edward III had been blessed with many children, but it was his sons who would create the tangled web of royal succession that would one day drip with blood. His eldest son, Edward the Black Prince, died before his father, leaving behind a young son, the future Richard II. The second son, Lionel of Antwerp, Duke of Clarence, died relatively young, but his bloodline continued through his daughter Philippa. The third son was John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, a powerful and influential man who would father the Lancastrian line of kings. Finally, there was Edmund of Langley, Duke of York, whose descendants would challenge their Lancastrian cousins for the throne. When Edward III died in 1377, the crown passed to his grandson Richard II, son of the Black Prince. But Richard's reign was troubled from the start. Surrounded by court intrigue and facing rebellion, he proved to be a weak and increasingly tyrannical ruler. In 1399, his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, son of John of Gaunt, returned from exile to reclaim his confiscated lands. What began as a quest for justice quickly transformed into a bid for the crown itself. Henry Bolingbroke deposed Richard II and declared himself King Henry IV, founding the House of Lancaster's hold on the English throne. Richard II mysteriously died in captivity shortly afterward, and whispers of murder followed Henry IV throughout his reign. This usurpation would later provide the legal foundation for the Yorkist claim, as the descendants of Lionel of Antwerp, Edward III's second son, could argue they had a superior hereditary right to the throne than the line of John of Gaunt, the third son. Henry V's reign was plagued by rebellions and constant threats to his legitimacy. He was succeeded by his charismatic son, Henry V, in 1413, who managed to unite the kingdom behind his spectacular victories in France during the 100 Years' War. Henry IV's triumph at Agincourt in 1415 made him a national hero and temporarily silenced questions about his family's right to rule. The young king seemed destined for even greater glory, but fate intervened cruelly. In August 1422, Henry V died suddenly of dysentery while campaigning in France, leaving behind a 9-month-old infant as his heir. Little Henry II inherited his father's 2 crowns, England and France, but none of his military genius or political acumen. The kingdom that had been united under Henry V's strong leadership now faced years of regency rule, with powerful nobles competing for influence over the child king. The regency period proved disastrous for English interests in France. Without Henry V's leadership, the English position began to crumble. The French, inspired by Joan of Arc, and later by more conventional military leadership, began systematically reclaiming their territory. By the 1450s, England had lost virtually all its French possessions except for the port of Calais, a humiliating reversal of Henry V's conquests. As Henry II grew to adulthood, it became increasingly clear that he had inherited none of his father's talents for kingship. Where Henry V had been a warrior king who led from the front, Henry VI was gentle, pious, and scholarly. Admirable qualities in a monk, perhaps, but dangerous weaknesses in a medieval monarch. He preferred prayer to politics, showed little interest in warfare, and seemed genuinely distressed by the violence that surrounded medieval kingship. Worse still, Henry VI began experiencing episodes of mental illness, possibly inherited from his maternal grandfather, Charles VI of France, who had suffered from similar afflictions. These periods of catatonia left the king completely unresponsive, unable to recognize even his closest advisors or make any royal decisions. During these episodes, the kingdom was effectively without a ruler, creating a dangerous power vacuum that ambitious nobles were quick to exploit. The loss of France had created enormous financial strain on the English crown, while leaving thousands of unemployed soldiers flooding back across the Channel. These hardened veterans, with no wars to fight and no pay to earn, often turned to brigandage or hired themselves out to the highest bidder among the nobility. The traditional bonds of loyalty that held medieval society together were fraying, replaced by a more mercenary attitude where allegiance could be bought and sold. Into this volatile situation stepped Richard, Duke of York, one of the most powerful and wealthy noblemen in England. Born in 1411, Richard had inherited vast estates from both his father's line and, crucially, from his mother Anne Mortimer, who descended from Lionel of Antwerp, Edward III's second son. This inheritance gave Richard not only immense wealth and lands, but also what many considered a stronger claim to the throne than Henry VI himself possessed. Richard of York had served the crown faithfully for years, acting as the king's representative in France and later in Ireland. But as England's position in France collapsed and Henry VI's mental health deteriorated, Richard began to see himself not as a potential usurper, but as the kingdom's salvation. He believed, quite sincerely, that his superior bloodline and proven administrative abilities made him better qualified to rule than the ineffective Henry VI. The immediate catalyst for conflict came through Richard's rivalry with Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, another descendant of Edward III, through John of Gaunt's legitimized children from his third marriage. Somerset held Henry VI's favour and was blamed by many, including Richard of York, for the military disasters in France. The two dukes represented different approaches to governance and foreign policy, but their rivalry quickly became personal and vindictive. When Henry VI suffered his first major mental breakdown in 1453, falling into a catatonic state that lasted over a year, Parliament was forced to appoint a protector of the realm. Despite Queen Margaret's efforts to claim the regency herself, Parliament chose Richard of York for this crucial role. Recognizing his royal blood, administrative experience, and powerful supporters, as protector, Richard proved to be an effective ruler. He reformed government finances, restored law and order, and even imprisoned his rival Somerset in the Tower of London. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Richard might provide the strong leadership that England desperately needed. But when Henry VI recovered his senses in late 1454, he immediately dismissed Richard from the protectorship and released Somerset from prison. This dismissal was more than a political setback for Richard. It was a humiliation that threatened his entire position. Having tasted power and proven his capabilities, he was unwilling to simply return to the sidelines while Somerset resumed his influence over the weak king. The stage was now set for armed conflict, as two irreconcilable visions of England's future faced each other across an increasingly divided kingdom. The personal animosity between Richard of York and Edmund Beaufort of Somerset had grown beyond mere political disagreement into something approaching hatred. Somerset's failures in France had cost England an empire, while his hold over Henry VI prevented any meaningful reform of the kingdom's problems. From Richard's perspective, Somerset was not just a political opponent, but a threat to England's very survival. Meanwhile, Henry VI's queen, Margaret of Anjou, was emerging as a formidable political force in her own right. Unlike her husband, Margaret possessed all the qualities of medieval leadership that Henry lacked: intelligence, determination, and ruthless pragmatism. She had initially hoped that her marriage to Henry would bring peace between England and France, but as the relationship between the two kingdoms continued to deteriorate, Margaret found herself fighting not for peace but for her husband's crown and her son's inheritance. The birth of Edward of Westminster in October 1453, during Henry's period of mental incapacity, provided the Lancastrian cause with a crucial advantage. No longer could Richard of York position himself as Henry's natural heir. There was now a direct male descendant to continue the Lancastrian line. But this development also raised the stakes considerably, as Margaret was now fighting not just for her husband's authority, but for her infant son's birthright. As 1454 turned to 1455, England found itself poised on the brink of civil war. The medieval world was one where disputes between great nobles were often settled by sword rather than law, and the long-standing grievances between York and Lancaster were approaching the point where only violence could resolve them. The kingdom that Henry V had united through his victories in France was about to tear itself apart in a conflict that would make the 100 Years' War seem like a mere prelude to the main event. The great magnates of England were being forced to choose sides, aligning themselves with either York or Lancaster based on family connections, regional loyalties, personal ambitions, and their assessment of which side was more likely to prevail. These decisions would echo through generations, as the Wars of the Roses would spare neither the high nor the low, consuming noble families, devastating the countryside, and fundamentally altering the nature of English monarchy. In the quiet chambers of Westminster Palace and the great castles scattered across England, men sharpened their swords and polished their armour, while women prayed for their husbands and sons. The roses of York and Lancaster, white and red, were about to bloom across England's green fields, watered with the blood of the kingdom's finest. Margaret, later known as Queen Margaret of Anjou, entered this world on March 23, 1430, in the Duchy of Lorraine. Born into a family where strong women were not merely accepted, but celebrated. Her father, René of Anjou, was known as Good King René. though his numerous royal titles masked the reality that he ruled over more crowns than kingdoms. Her mother, Isabella, Duchess of Lorraine, was a woman of remarkable capability who ruled as regent during her husband's captivity, providing young Margaret with an early example of feminine strength and political acumen. The young Margaret grew up in a world of French romance and chivalry, spending her childhood between the castle at Tarascon on the river Rhône and the old royal palace at Capua, near Naples. She was known to her family as La Petite Créature, the little creature, a nickname that belied the fierce determination that would one day make her one of the most formidable queens in English history. From an early age, Margaret showed a passion for French romances and hunting, activities that would serve her well in the rough and tumble world of English politics. Margaret's family lineage was steeped in the tradition of powerful women who wielded political authority. Her grandmother, Yolande of Aragon, had been a formidable political force who helped orchestrate the rise of Charles VII of France and supported Joan of Arc's mission. This heritage of strong, politically active women would profoundly influence Margaret's own approach to queenship when she arrived in England. The marriage negotiations that would bring 15-year-old Margaret to England were part of a desperate English attempt to secure peace with France and salvage something from the ruins of Henry V's empire. By the 1440s, England's position in France was becoming increasingly untenable, and diplomatic marriage was seen as the last hope for preserving English interests. Margaret's marriage to Henry VI was arranged as part of the Truce of Tours in 1444, a temporary cessation of hostilities that both sides hoped might lead to lasting peace. The terms of Margaret's marriage were controversial from the start. Unlike most royal brides, Margaret brought no substantial dowry to England. Indeed, the marriage agreement actually required England to surrender the important territories of Maine and Anjou to France. This concession infuriated many English nobles, who saw it as a humiliating capitulation that betrayed the sacrifices made during the 100 Years' War. From the moment she set foot on English soil, Margaret would be associated in many minds with England's military failures and territorial losses. Margaret's journey to England in March 1445 was marked by elaborate pageantry designed to impress both the English people and foreign observers with the magnificence of the English court. She landed from Portsmouth to great fanfare, then proceeded through Winchester to London, where she was crowned Queen at Westminster Abbey on May 30, 1445. The coronation ceremonies were spectacular, featuring elaborate pageants, processions, and celebrations that temporarily masked the underlying tensions in English society. The early years of Margaret's marriage to Henry VI seemed to follow the conventional pattern expected of a medieval queen consort. She participated in religious ceremonies, interceded with the king on behalf of petitioners, mediated disputes, and collected alms for the poor. Contemporary accounts suggest that she initially maintained cordial relationships with most of the English nobility, including Richard, Duke of York, who would later become her greatest enemy. However, Margaret's failure to produce an heir during her first 8 years of marriage became a source of increasing concern and criticism. In medieval England, a queen's primary duty was to provide male heirs to continue the royal line, and Margaret's apparent barrenness was seen by some as a sign of divine displeasure with the Lancastrian dynasty. Rumours began to circulate about the validity of her marriage and her fitness to be queen, whispers that would grow louder as political tensions increased. The transformation of Margaret from conventional queen consort to political leader began gradually as Henry VI's mental health deteriorated and the kingdom's problems multiplied. Unlike her gentle, scholarly husband, Margaret possessed the steel necessary for medieval leadership. She was intelligent, determined, and utterly ruthless when necessary, qualities that Henry VI conspicuously lacked. As it became clear that Henry was incapable of providing strong leadership, Margaret began to step into the void. Margaret's political awakening coincided with the rise of Richard, Duke of York, as a major threat to Lancastrian rule. Initially, their relationship appears to have been cordial. York had even served as one of her escorts during her journey to England. But as York's criticism of the government's policies intensified and his own ambitions became clearer, Margaret began to see him not as a loyal duke serving the crown, but as a dangerous rival who threatened her husband's throne and her own position. The birth of Edward of Westminster on October 13, 1453, transformed Margaret's role completely. After 8 years of marriage, she had finally provided the Lancastrian dynasty with a male heir, but the timing could hardly have been worse. Henry VI was in the midst of one of his most severe mental breakdowns, lying catatonic and unresponsive, even to the news of his son's birth. With Henry incapacitated and Richard of York positioning himself to claim the succession, Margaret found herself fighting not just for her husband's crown, but for her infant son's inheritance. Margaret's attempted bid for the regency during Henry's illness revealed both her political ambitions and the limitations she faced as a woman in medieval England. Despite her intelligence and capability, Parliament refused to grant her the formal authority she sought, instead choosing Richard of York as protector of the realm. This rejection was a bitter lesson in the realities of male-dominated medieval politics, but it also steeled Margaret's resolve to fight through other means for her family's survival. When Henry VI recovered from his mental illness in late 1454, Margaret moved quickly to consolidate Lancastrian power and eliminate the threat posed by York. She encouraged Henry to dismiss York from the protectorship and worked to surround the king with loyal supporters who would resist any future Yorkist attempts to seize control. Her influence over her husband became so pronounced that enemies began to characterize Henry as weak and dominated by his foreign wife. Margaret's reputation for ruthlessness began to develop during this period, as she showed herself willing to use any means necessary to protect her family's interests. She cultivated relationships with powerful nobles who opposed York, promised rewards to those who supported the Lancastrian cause, and allegedly even encouraged violent action against her enemies. Contemporary chronicles, admittedly often written by her enemies, began to portray her as a scheming foreign interloper who manipulated her weak husband for her own purposes. The breakdown of relations between Margaret and Richard of York became irreversible after York's dismissal from the protectorship. Each side began to see the other as an existential threat that could only be eliminated through force. Margaret's transformation into a war leader was driven not by personal ambition, but by maternal instinct. She was fighting to secure her son's inheritance in a world where political defeat often meant death or permanent exile. Margaret's political style was markedly different from the chivalric ideals that supposedly governed medieval nobility. She was practical rather than romantic, focused on results rather than honor, and willing to ally with anyone who could serve her purposes. This pragmatic approach would serve her well in the brutal conflicts ahead, but it also reinforced her enemies' portrayal of her as an unnaturally aggressive woman who had abandoned proper feminine roles. As tensions escalated toward open conflict, Margaret began to assemble the coalition of nobles, knights, and commoners who would form the core of Lancastrian resistance to Yorkist ambitions. She cultivated relationships with the great northern families, the Beauforts, and other traditional supporters of the Lancastrian dynasty, while also reaching out to newer allies who might be won over through promises of reward or threats of punishment. The stage was now set for the tragic drama that would unfold over the next 3 decades. Margaret of Anjou, the young French princess who had come to England seeking peace, was about to become the she-wolf of France, a warrior queen whose determination to protect her family would help fuel the bloodiest civil war in English history. Her journey from conventional queen consort to political leader reflected both her own remarkable character and the extraordinary circumstances that forced her to choose between submission and survival. Richard, later known as the third Duke of York, was born on September 21st, 1411, at Conisbrough Castle in Yorkshire. Though his life began under the shadow of tragedy and treason that would seem to prophesy his eventual fate, his father, Richard of Conisbrough, Earl of Cambridge, was executed in 1415 for his part in the Southampton plot against Henry V, leaving the 4-year-old Richard orphaned and technically tainted by his father's treason. Yet fortune smiled upon the young orphan in unexpected ways. His uncle, Edward, 2nd Duke of York, died fighting valiantly at the Battle of Agincourt just months after his father's execution, and Richard inherited the ducal title along with the extensive Yorkshire estates. More crucially, when his maternal uncle Edmund Mortimer, 5th Earl of March, died childless in 1425, 14-year-old Richard also inherited the vast Mortimer estates and, most significantly, their claim to the English throne through descent from Lionel of Antwerp, Duke of Clarence, Edward III's second son. This double inheritance transformed Richard from a potentially problematic orphan into one of the wealthiest and most powerful noblemen in England. His lands stretched across Wales, the Welsh Marches, Ireland, and England itself, generating an income that rivaled that of the crown. But it was the Mortimer inheritance that would prove most fateful, for it gave Richard what many legal scholars considered a superior hereditary claim to the throne compared to the Lancastrian kings who descended from John of Gaunt, Edward III's third son. As a royal ward, Richard was placed under the guardianship of Ralph Neville, Earl of Westmoreland, and his wife Joan Beaufort, a half-sister to Henry IV. This arrangement, intended to integrate the potentially dangerous York heir into the Lancastrian power structure, instead provided Richard with valuable connections to the powerful Neville family network. In 1429, when Richard was 18, he married Cecily Neville, daughter of his guardian, in what would prove to be both a love match and a political alliance of enormous significance. Cecily Neville, known as the Rose of Raby, was herself descended from royalty and brought her own considerable inheritance to the marriage. More importantly, she possessed the intelligence, beauty, and strength of character that would make her Richard's closest advisor and most stalwart supporter. Their marriage would produce 13 children, including 2 future kings of England, Edward IV and Richard III, and would create family bonds that would sustain the Yorkist cause through decades of conflict. Richard's early adult years were marked by loyal service to the Lancastrian crown. Despite the superior hereditary claim he might have pressed, he served as King Henry VI's lieutenant in France from 1436 to 1437, and again from 1440 to 1445, struggling valiantly to maintain English possessions against increasingly successful French resistance. His military and administrative competence during these difficult years earned him respect among his contemporaries and demonstrated the leadership qualities that Henry VI so conspicuously lacked. The contrast between Richard's capabilities and Henry VI's deficiencies became increasingly apparent as the 1440s progressed. Where Henry was gentle and scholarly, Richard was decisive and practical. Where Henry avoided conflict and decision-making, Richard embraced the responsibilities of leadership. Where Henry was influenced by court favourites and seemed incapable of independent judgment, Richard demonstrated the political acumen expected of medieval nobility. Richard's growing frustration with royal policy became focused on his rivalry with Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, who held Henry VI's favour despite his disastrous military leadership in France. Somerset's surrender of Maine and Anjou as part of Margaret of Anjou's marriage settlement particularly incensed Richard, who saw these territorial concessions as a betrayal of English soldiers' sacrifices and a humiliating admission of defeat. The personal animosity between Richard and Somerset would become one of the driving forces behind the Wars of the Roses. The crisis that would eventually lead to war began with Henry VI's first major mental breakdown in August 1453. The king fell into a catatonic state, unable to recognize courtiers, respond to questions, or make any decisions. For over a year, England was effectively without a ruler, creating a dangerous power vacuum that threatened the kingdom's stability. During this period, Richard's wife Cecily gave birth to their son Edmund, while Queen Margaret of Anjou gave birth to Edward of Westminster, adding a new generation to the growing succession crisis. Parliament's decision to appoint Richard as protector of the realm during Henry's incapacity was both inevitable and transformative. As the highest-ranking duke in the kingdom and the king's closest adult male relative, Richard was the obvious choice for this crucial role. His appointment gave him the authority he needed to address the kingdom's mounting problems, but it also gave him a taste of royal power that would prove impossible to surrender. As protector, Richard demonstrated the effective leadership that England had been lacking. He reformed government finances, which had been badly mismanaged under Somerset's influence. He worked to restore law and order in regions where royal authority had effectively collapsed. He reorganized the military and took steps to defend England's remaining French possessions. Most controversially, he imprisoned Somerset in the Tower of London, effectively removing his greatest rival from the political scene. Richard's protectorship also revealed his vision for English government, one based on competent administration, fiscal responsibility, and strong royal leadership. He surrounded himself with capable advisors, many drawn from his Neville relatives, and worked to rebuild the networks of loyalty and obligation that held medieval society together. For a brief period, it seemed as though Richard might provide the stability and leadership that England desperately needed. However, Henry VI's recovery in December 1454 shattered Richard's hopes for peaceful reform. The king's first act upon regaining his senses was to dismiss Richard from the protectorship and release Somerset from the Tower. This reversal was more than a political setback for Richard. It was a humiliating repudiation of everything he had accomplished, and a clear indication that Somerset would resume his dominant influence over royal policy. The dismissal forced Richard to confront a terrible choice: accept his exclusion from power and watch Somerset's continued mismanagement destroy the kingdom, or take up arms to force the changes he believed essential for England's survival. The decision was complicated by Richard's genuine belief in his superior hereditary claim to the throne, and his conviction that Henry VI's mental instability made him unfit to rule. Richard's decision to resort to armed resistance was not made lightly or suddenly. Medieval political culture provided few alternatives for resolving disputes between great nobles, and Richard had exhausted the peaceful options available to him. His exclusion from court, combined with Somerset's return to power, convinced him that only force could compel the changes necessary to save the kingdom from continued decline. The gathering of Richard's army in early 1455 marked the point of no return in his relationship with Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou. By taking up arms against his anointed king, Richard was committing himself to a course that could end only in victory or death. There would be no possibility of reconciliation once blood was shed, no return to the collaborative relationship he had once enjoyed with the royal court. Richard's supporters included his Neville relatives, particularly his brother-in-law Richard Neville, Earl of Salisbury, and Salisbury's son Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, who would become known as the Kingmaker for his role in the coming conflicts. These family connections provided Richard with a formidable military network and the resources necessary to challenge royal authority effectively. As Richard's forces marched toward their fateful encounter with the King's army at St. Albans, the Duke was driven by a complex mixture of motives: loyalty to what he saw as England's true interests, frustration with royal incompetence, personal hatred of Somerset, and perhaps, lurking beneath it all, the knowledge that his own claim to the throne was stronger than that of the man who wore the crown. The transformation of Richard from loyal duke to armed rebel marked a watershed moment in English history, as the kingdom prepared to tear itself apart in a conflict that would consume a generation and fundamentally alter the nature of English monarchy. The Wars of the Roses were about to begin, and Richard Plantagenet, Duke of York, would be remembered as the man whose ambitions and grievances lit the fire that would burn through 3 decades of English history. The first engagement in what would become known as the Wars of the Roses began not with the thunderous clash of massive armies, but with a small, almost intimate encounter in the narrow streets of St. Albans on May 22nd, 1455. The irony was profound. This civil war that would devastate England for 30 years started as what was essentially a skirmish between a few thousand men in a sleepy market town north of London. Richard, Duke of York, had gathered his forces at his castle of Sandal in Yorkshire before marching south with an army of perhaps 3,000 men. His most crucial supporters were his Neville relatives, Richard Neville, Earl of Salisbury, and Salisbury's son, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. These 3 men, York, Salisbury, and Warwick, would become the triumvirate that led the Yorkist cause through its early phases, their family bonds providing the unity and trust essential for effective military cooperation. King Henry VI, accompanied by Queen Margaret and their most trusted advisers, including the despised Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, had left London to confront the Yorkist threat. The royal army was similar in size to York's force, but it included many lords who were present more from obligation than enthusiasm. The king's mental fragility made him an uncertain leader, and command effectively fell to Somerset and the other senior nobles accompanying the royal party. As the 2 armies approached St. Albans, both sides made ritual attempts at negotiation. As medieval chivalric conventions demanded, York sent messages to Henry VI protesting his loyalty to the crown while demanding the surrender of Somerset and other evil counsellors who he claimed had misled the king. These exchanges were largely theatrical. Both sides knew that peaceful resolution was impossible given the irreconcilable nature of their differences. The Battle of St. Albans itself lasted only a few hours, but its consequences would echo through generations. York's forces attacked the royalist positions in the town's narrow streets, where the king's army found itself at a tactical disadvantage. The fighting was fierce but brief, concentrated around the castle inn and the streets leading to the market square, where Henry VI had positioned himself. The decisive moment came when Warwick's men broke through the royalist lines and reached the area where Somerset and his closest supporters were fighting. In the brutal hand-to-hand combat that followed, Somerset was struck down and killed, along with several other prominent Lancastrian nobles, including Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, and Lord Clifford. Their deaths removed some of York's most determined enemies and created a power vacuum in the Lancastrian leadership that would take years to fill. King Henry VI himself was slightly wounded in the neck by an arrow during the battle, though whether by accident or design remained unclear. The sight of their injured king effectively ended Lancastrian resistance, as the surviving nobles were unwilling to risk further royal casualties. Henry was taken into Yorkist custody, though York was careful to treat the king with the respect due his royal status. The immediate aftermath of St Albans revealed both the potential and the limitations of Yorkist success. York had eliminated his most dangerous enemies and gained temporary control over the king, but he had also crossed a line from which there could be no return. By taking up arms against his anointed sovereign, York had committed acts that could be construed as treason, creating a situation where reconciliation would be extremely difficult. York's behavior following his victory demonstrated his complex motivations and political sophistication. Rather than claiming the throne outright, which his military success might have enabled, he instead emphasized his loyalty to Henry VI, while insisting on his right to serve as the king's principal advisor. This approach reflected York's genuine belief that he could reform the kingdom's government while maintaining the fiction of Lancastrian legitimacy. The Yorkist triumph at St Albans was followed by a carefully choreographed return to London, where York stage-managed Henry VI's public appearances to demonstrate royal approval of the new political arrangements. The king, whether from genuine gratitude for his respectful treatment or simple recognition of political reality, agreed to reappoint York as protector of the realm and to exclude Somerset's supporters from positions of influence. However, this Yorkist success contained the seeds of its own destruction. Queen Margaret had not been present at St Albans, and her absence meant that the most determined defender of Lancastrian interests remained free to organise resistance to York's dominance. Margaret viewed York's victory not as a legitimate political outcome, but as a treasonous assault on her husband's authority and her son's inheritance. The period between 1455 and 1459 represented an uneasy truce during which both sides prepared for the larger conflict they knew was inevitable. York used his position as protector to consolidate his power base, reward his supporters, and attempt to address the kingdom's financial and administrative problems. His second protectorship was more successful than the first, as he now had the military victory at St Albans to reinforce his political authority. Margaret of Anjou spent these same years building her own coalition of support, particularly among the great northern families whose members had been killed at St Albans. The Percys and Cliffords, in particular, became devoted enemies of the House of York, driven by personal vengeance as well as political loyalty to the Lancastrian cause. Margaret's French connections also proved valuable, as she was able to secure promises of support from her homeland should the conflict escalate. The fragility of the post-St Albans settlement became apparent in early 1456, when Henry VI dismissed York from the protectorship for the second time. Unlike the previous dismissal, this one occurred after York had demonstrated his military capabilities, making it clear to all observers that political disputes between York and Lancaster would likely be settled by force rather than negotiation. The years 1456 to 1459 witnessed an escalating series of provocations and military preparations as both sides positioned themselves for renewed conflict. York spent much of this period at his strongholds in Wales and the Welsh Marches, building up his military forces and consolidating his territorial base. Margaret, meanwhile, worked to isolate York politically while strengthening her own military capabilities. The final breakdown of relations came in 1459 with the Parliament of Devils at Coventry, a packed assembly dominated by Margaret's supporters that formally condemned York, Salisbury, and Warwick as traitors. This parliamentary condemnation removed any lingering legal pretense from the conflict. The Wars of the Roses were now openly acknowledged as a struggle between rival claimants for the English throne. The Yorkist response to their condemnation was swift and decisive. Rather than submit to what they viewed as a judicial murder, York and his allies raised their banners in open rebellion. The brief period of uneasy coexistence that had followed St. Albans was over, replaced by the recognition that only complete victory or total defeat could end the conflict between York and Lancaster. The Battle of Blore Heath in September 1459 demonstrated that St. Albans had been merely the opening engagement in a much larger war. Salisbury's victory over a superior Lancastrian force showed that the Yorkists remained formidable opponents despite their parliamentary condemnation. However, the subsequent Yorkist defeat at Ludford Bridge forced York to flee to Ireland, while Warwick escaped to Calais, apparently ending the Yorkist threat. Yet, even in apparent defeat, the Yorkist cause remained alive. York's exile to Ireland and Warwick's control of Calais provided them with secure bases from which to organise their return. The first phase of the Wars of the Roses had ended with the Yorkist leadership scattered and condemned, but the fundamental issues that had caused the conflict remained unresolved. Margaret of Anjou's triumph seemed complete, but it rested on the continued incapacity of her husband and the loyalty of nobles whose own interests might not always align with the Lancastrian cause. The stage was set for an even more dramatic phase of the conflict, as the exiled Yorkist leaders prepared to return with foreign support and renewed determination to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. The winter of 1460 brought with it the most shocking and brutal episode in the early phase of the Wars of the Roses, an event so steeped in cruelty and symbolism that it would haunt the memories of all who witnessed it and fuel decades of revenge killings that followed. The Battle of Wakefield, fought on December 30th, 1460, would transform Richard, Duke of York, from a living threat into a martyred symbol, while revealing the depths of hatred that the Civil War had awakened in English noble society. Richard had returned from his Irish exile in September 1460, landing at Chester with a small force but grand ambitions. His return coincided with dramatic Yorkist successes elsewhere. His ally Warwick had already defeated the Lancastrians at Northampton in July, capturing King Henry VI and effectively controlling the royal government. These victories had emboldened Richard to make his most audacious move yet, a formal claim to the English throne based on his superior hereditary rights. The Act of Accord, passed by Parliament in October 1460, represented the closest Richard would ever come to achieving his ultimate ambition peacefully. This remarkable document recognised Richard as Henry VI's rightful heir, bypassing the claims of Henry's young son, Edward of Westminster, in favour of York's supposedly superior bloodline. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the succession dispute might be resolved without further bloodshed, with Richard content to wait for Henry's natural death to claim the crown. But the Act of Accord proved to be Richard's fatal miscalculation. By formally disinheriting Edward of Westminster, Richard had given Queen Margaret a cause that would unite every Lancastrian supporter behind her banner. No longer was this a dispute between rival nobles seeking influence over a weak king. It had become a fight for a mother's child, a battle that Margaret would wage with the ferocity of a lioness defending her cub. Margaret's response to the Act of Accord was swift and decisive. She fled north to her traditional strongholds in Northumberland and Yorkshire, where the great northern families, the Percys, Cliffords, and their allies, had been nursing their grievances since the deaths of their kinsmen at St. Albans 5 years earlier. These powerful clans needed little encouragement to take up arms against the House of York, particularly when their cause was now sanctified by defence of the legitimate royal heir. The army that Margaret assembled in the winter of 1460 was unlike any force that had previously taken the field during the Wars of the Roses, where earlier engagements had been fought primarily by professional soldiers and noble retainers. Margaret's northern host included thousands of common soldiers motivated by regional loyalty, personal grievance, and genuine devotion to the Lancastrian cause. These men fought not just for pay or feudal obligation, but for deeply held beliefs about legitimacy and justice. Richard's decision to spend Christmas 1460 at Sandal Castle near Wakefield reflected both his confidence and his strategic miscalculation. Sandal was one of his principal strongholds, a formidable fortress that should have been impregnable to assault. Richard appears to have believed that his recent successes and parliamentary recognition as heir made him secure from serious attack. This confidence would prove tragically misplaced. The precise circumstances of how Richard came to leave the safety of Sandal Castle on that fatal December morning remain shrouded in mystery and conflicting accounts. Some contemporary chronicles suggest that he was lured out by false intelligence about the size and location of enemy forces. Others propose that he was tricked by Sir Andrew Trollope, a professional soldier who may have promised to defect from the Lancastrian cause while actually serving as Margaret's agent. The most intriguing theory suggests that Richard was drawn into battle by his own chivalric code and personal honour. According to this account, Lancastrian forces had positioned themselves within sight of Sandal Castle and begun ravaging the surrounding countryside, killing Richard's tenants and burning his properties. Unable to watch this destruction from behind his castle walls without appearing cowardly, Richard felt compelled to ride out and confront his enemies, despite being heavily outnumbered. Whatever the specific circumstances, Richard's decision to give battle on December 30th proved catastrophic. His force, estimated at around 5,000 men, found itself facing a Lancastrian army nearly twice that size. The battle was fought in the field south of Sandal Castle, where the Yorkists quickly discovered they were trapped in what amounted to a carefully planned ambush. The fighting at Wakefield was particularly savage, characterized by a level of personal violence that exceeded even the brutal norms of medieval warfare. This was no longer a political dispute between rival claimants. It had become a blood feud between families whose hatred had been intensified by years of mutual slaughter. Quarter was neither asked nor given as men fought with the desperate fury of those who knew that defeat meant death. Richard himself fought bravely in the thick of the battle, reportedly cutting down several enemies before being overwhelmed by superior numbers. Contemporary accounts describe him making a final stand surrounded by his most loyal followers, his banner still flying even as his position became hopeless. The sight of the Duke of York fighting desperately for his life while his enemies closed in around him became one of the iconic images of the Wars of the Roses. The moment of Richard's death marked more than the end of a battle. It represented the transformation of the Wars of the Roses from a political conflict into something approaching a genocidal struggle between competing dynasties. Richard had been not just a rival claimant, but the father of the next generation of Yorkist leaders. His death ensured that the conflict would continue with renewed intensity as his sons sought to avenge their father's murder. But it was the treatment of Richard's body after his death that truly shocked contemporary society and demonstrated how completely the normal rules of chivalric warfare had broken down. Medieval convention demanded that the bodies of fallen nobles be treated with respect, properly buried, and their families allowed to mourn their dead with dignity. Instead, Margaret's forces subjected Richard's corpse to deliberate humiliation, designed to destroy his reputation and demoralize his supporters. Richard's head was severed from his body and taken to the city of York, where it was impaled on a spike above Micklegate Bar, one of the main gates into the city. To add insult to injury, Margaret's supporters placed a paper crown upon the severed head, a cruel mockery of Richard's royal ambitions and a reminder to all who saw it that this was the fate awaiting those who challenged legitimate Lancastrian authority. The paper crown became one of the most powerful and enduring symbols of the Wars of the Roses, representing both the depths of cruelty to which the conflict had sunk, and the complete breakdown of the chivalric ideals that were supposed to govern noble behaviour. Contemporary chroniclers, even those sympathetic to the Lancastrian cause, were shocked by this deliberate degradation of a fallen enemy, seeing it as a violation of the codes that held medieval society together. The display of Richard's crowned head above the gates of York was intended as a triumphant statement of Lancastrian victory, but it achieved precisely the opposite effect. Instead of demoralizing York supporters, the gruesome spectacle transformed Richard into a martyr whose death demanded vengeance. His 18-year-old son, Edward, now the 4th Duke of York, received news of his father's death while in the Welsh marches, and immediately began gathering forces to continue the Yorkist cause. Margaret's victory at Wakefield was complete in military terms. She had eliminated the primary threat to her son's inheritance and scattered the remaining Yorkist forces, but the manner of her triumph had unleashed forces that would ultimately prove beyond her control. The paper crown that mocked Richard's royal ambitions would become a rallying symbol for his supporters, while the cruelty displayed toward his remains would justify equally savage reprisals in battles yet to come. The aftermath of Wakefield also revealed the regional dimensions of the Wars of the Roses. Margaret's northern army, emboldened by victory and enriched by the spoils of war, began moving south toward London. Their advance was marked by widespread pillaging and destruction as undisciplined troops took revenge on communities suspected of Yorkist sympathies. This behaviour alienated potential supporters and gave the conflict an increasingly bitter class dimension. Young Edward of York's response to his father's death demonstrated both his political maturity and his understanding that the Wars of the Roses had entered a new and more deadly phase. Rather than seeking immediate revenge through a hasty assault on Margaret's forces, he took time to consolidate his position, win new allies, and prepare for the systematic campaign that would be necessary to overthrow Lancastrian rule. The paper crown of Wakefield thus became a symbol of transformation. It marked the moment when a dynastic dispute became a war of extermination, when political rivals became blood enemies, and when the rules of medieval warfare gave way to a more brutal and personal form of conflict. Richard's death had ended one phase of the Wars of the Roses, but the manner of his dying ensured that the war itself would continue with unprecedented ferocity. Edward, later known as King Edward IV of England, was thrust into leadership of the Yorkist cause at the age of 18, through circumstances that would have broken a lesser man. The news of his father's death and horrific treatment at Wakefield reached young Edward while he was in the Welsh marches, attempting to recruit support for the family cause. Instead of being crushed by grief or paralysed by the magnitude of his inheritance, Edward demonstrated the remarkable resilience and political acumen that would characterise his entire career. Standing nearly 6 feet 4 inches tall in an age when most men barely reached 5.5 feet, Edward possessed the physical presence that medieval society expected in its leaders. Contemporary accounts describe him as exceptionally handsome, with golden hair, piercing blue eyes, and the kind of natural charisma that drew men to follow him into battle. But it was his intelligence and political sophistication, rather than merely his appearance, that would transform him from a teenage exile into one of England's most successful kings. Edward's first priority after receiving news of Wakefield was to prevent the complete collapse of Yorkist resistance. His father's death had left the cause without its recognised leader, while many Yorkist supporters were either dead, captured, or fleeing into exile. The young Duke needed to demonstrate both his capability and his legitimacy as Richard's successor if he hoped to maintain any coherent opposition to Lancastrian rule. The transformation of Edward from Duke to King began at the Battle of Mortimer's Cross on February 2, 1461, an engagement that would be remembered as much for its supernatural portents as for its military significance. As Edward's army prepared for battle against a Lancastrian force led by Jasper Tudor, Earl of Pembroke, and James Butler, Earl of Wiltshire, a remarkable meteorological phenomenon appeared in the winter sky above the battlefield. 3 suns rose that morning, a rare atmospheric effect called a parhelion that medieval minds immediately interpreted as divine intervention. Edward, displaying the political genius that would serve him throughout his reign, seized upon this natural wonder as a sign of divine favour for his cause. He told his men that the 3 suns represented the Trinity blessing their enterprise, and that this heavenly approval guaranteed their victory over the enemies of righteous rule. The Battle of Mortimer's Cross itself proved Edward's interpretation correct, as his forces achieved a decisive victory over the Lancastrian army. The Yorkist triumph was so complete that several enemy leaders were captured and subsequently executed, including Owen Tudor, grandfather of the future Henry VII. These executions demonstrated Edward's understanding that the Wars of the Roses had moved beyond the gentlemanly conflicts of his father's generation into an era where defeated enemies could not be allowed to survive and fight again. Edward's adoption of the sun in splendour as his personal badge following Mortimer's Cross showed his sophisticated understanding of medieval symbolism and propaganda. The 3 suns that had appeared on the morning of his victory became a powerful recruiting tool, convincing potential supporters that God himself favoured the Yorkist cause. This early demonstration of Edward's ability to combine military success with effective political theatre would characterise his entire approach to kingship. While Edward was achieving victory in the Welsh marches, Queen Margaret's northern army was advancing south toward London, having defeated Warwick at the Second Battle of St Albans and rescued King Henry VI from Yorkist custody. Margaret's triumph seemed to have restored Lancastrian supremacy, but her failure to control her undisciplined northern troops proved a crucial strategic error that would ultimately cost her the crown. The behaviour of Margaret's army during its southward march created widespread terror among the civilian population. Contemporary chronicles describe scenes of systematic pillaging, rape, and murder as undisciplined soldiers took revenge on communities suspected of Yorkist sympathies. This reign of terror turned public opinion against the Lancastrian cause and made Edward's eventual arrival in London appear as a liberation rather than a conquest. London's reception of Margaret's approaching army revealed the complex political calculations that influenced the Wars of the Roses. The city's merchants and craftsmen, who formed the backbone of its political life, feared that Margaret's northern host would sack the capital as thoroughly as it had ravaged the countryside during its advance. When Margaret hesitated to enter London with her uncontrolled forces, she missed a crucial opportunity to consolidate her position and secure the resources necessary for continued resistance. Edward's race to reach London before Margaret could establish her authority there became one of the most dramatic episodes in the entire conflict, moving with remarkable speed considering the winter conditions and the distance involved. Edward's army covered over 200 miles in less than 2 weeks, arriving at London on February 26, 1461, just ahead of the Lancastrian forces. London's enthusiastic welcome for Edward reflected both relief at being spared occupation by Margaret's army and genuine enthusiasm for the young Yorkist leader. Contemporary accounts describe crowds lining the streets to cheer Edward's arrival, while the city's leaders formally recognized him as the rightful King of England. This popular acclaim provided Edward with the legitimacy he needed to claim the crown, even though he had not yet defeated his enemies in battle. Edward's coronation as Edward IV on March 4, 1461, at Westminster Abbey, was both a political necessity and a calculated risk. By claiming the crown before achieving complete military victory, Edward was gambling his entire cause on his ability to defeat Margaret's forces in the decisive battle that everyone knew must come. If he lost that battle, his brief reign would end in death or exile, and the Yorkist cause would die with him. The ceremony itself was deliberately magnificent, designed to demonstrate both Edward's confidence in ultimate victory and his respect for the traditional forms of English kingship. Unlike his father, who had never formally claimed the throne, Edward embraced his royal status fully, understanding that half measures would no longer suffice in the increasingly desperate struggle for England's crown. Margaret's decision to retreat northward rather than risk a battle for London proved to be another crucial strategic error. By abandoning the capital without a fight, she allowed Edward to consolidate his position and secure the resources necessary for the campaign that would follow. Her retreat also created the impression that the Lancastrian cause lacked confidence in its ability to defend its claims through force of arms. The pursuit of Margaret's army northward led inexorably toward the confrontation at Towton, which would prove to be the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. Edward's decision to follow Margaret into Yorkshire demonstrated both his strategic understanding and his personal courage. He was willing to risk everything on a single engagement, rather than allow his enemies to regroup and potentially threaten London again. The march north, through the early spring of 1461, gave Edward his first real test as a military commander leading a major campaign. His handling of logistics, intelligence gathering, and army morale during this crucial period demonstrated skills that would serve him well throughout his reign. Contemporary accounts describe him personally inspiring his troops, sharing their hardships, and maintaining the high spirits necessary for successful military operations. Edward's youth proved to be an advantage rather than a liability during this campaign. At 19, he possessed the energy and optimism necessary to sustain his followers through the grueling winter march, while his relative inexperience was offset by the advice of veteran commanders like Warwick and the Norfolk contingent that had joined his cause. His willingness to listen to counsel while maintaining firm control over strategic decisions showed a political maturity far beyond his years. The approaching battle at Towton would determine whether Edward's dramatic rise represented genuine political transformation or merely a temporary disruption of Lancastrian rule. Everything the Yorkist cause had achieved since Richard's death at Wakefield would be tested in the snowy fields of Yorkshire, where two armies representing different visions of England's future prepared to settle their differences through the ancient arbitrament of war. Edward's transformation from grieving son to crowned king in less than 2 months represented one of the most remarkable political ascents in English history. But the true test of his achievement lay ahead, in the bitter struggle that would determine whether the white rose of York would bloom permanently in English soil or be crushed beneath the red rose of Lancaster. In the bloodiest battle of the medieval age, Edward, now established as King Edward IV, after his crushing victory at Towton, seemed to possess every advantage that medieval kingship could offer. He was young, handsome, charismatic, and militarily successful, with a kingdom that appeared finally at peace after years of devastating civil war. Yet it was in this moment of triumph that Edward would make the decision that would ultimately unravel his carefully constructed political coalition and lead to the most dramatic betrayal in the history of the Wars of the Roses. The decision that would change everything began innocuously enough on a spring morning in 1464, when the young king decided to go hunting in the Royal Forest near Grafton in Northamptonshire. Edward had developed a reputation as a lover of outdoor pursuits and female company, characteristics that his advisors generally tolerated as harmless diversions for a vigorous young monarch. What none of them anticipated was that this particular hunting expedition would lead to a secret marriage that would split the Yorkist coalition and reignite the civil war they thought they had won. Elizabeth Woodville, the woman who would capture Edward's heart and ultimately contribute to his downfall, was everything that medieval political wisdom suggested a royal bride should not be. She was English rather than foreign, which eliminated the possibility of valuable international alliances. She was a commoner rather than nobility, which provided no additional military or financial support for the crown. Most problematically of all, she was a widow with 2 young sons from her previous marriage to Sir John Grey, a Lancastrian knight killed fighting against the Yorkists at the Second Battle of St. Albans. Yet Elizabeth possessed qualities that transcended these political disadvantages. Contemporary accounts consistently describe her as exceptionally beautiful, with the golden hair and fair complexion that medieval society prized in its feminine ideals. More importantly, she displayed the intelligence, dignity, and strength of character that would make her one of the most formidable queens in English history. Her Lancastrian background, while politically problematic, had also taught her the realities of dynastic conflict and the importance of protecting family interests. The circumstances of Edward and Elizabeth's first meeting have become the stuff of romantic legend, though the truth was probably more complex than later chroniclers suggested. According to the most popular version of the story, Elizabeth positioned herself beneath an oak tree on Edward's hunting route, accompanied by her 2 young sons, to petition the king for the return of her late husband's confiscated estates. When Edward saw this beautiful widow with her children, he was immediately smitten and began pursuing her with characteristic royal determination. Elizabeth's response to Edward's advances revealed both her intelligence and her understanding of the dangerous game she was playing. Rather than succumbing immediately to royal charm, she insisted on marriage as the price of her surrender, understanding that becoming merely another royal mistress would ultimately leave her powerless and discarded. This insistence on honourable marriage demonstrated both her personal virtue and her political sophistication. The secret marriage ceremony took place on May 1st, 1464, at Elizabeth's family home in Grafton, with only a handful of witnesses present, including Elizabeth's mother, Jacquetta of Luxembourg, herself a woman of noble birth, who understood the implications of her daughter's remarkable match. The secrecy was necessary because Edward knew that his advisers, particularly the powerful Earl of Warwick, would strenuously oppose any marriage that failed to advance Yorkist political interests. For several months, Edward managed to keep his marriage secret, while Warwick and other advisers continued their efforts to arrange a diplomatically advantageous foreign match. Warwick, in particular, had been negotiating a potential marriage between Edward and a French princess, seeing such an alliance as crucial for securing Yorkist rule against potential Lancastrian threats. The Earl's investment in these negotiations would make Edward's eventual revelation particularly devastating. The revelation of Edward's marriage in September 1464 sent shockwaves through the Yorkist establishment and fundamentally altered the balance of power within the coalition that had brought Edward to the throne. Warwick, who had styled himself the Kingmaker and expected to remain the power behind the throne, suddenly found himself confronted with a king who was prepared to make crucial decisions without consultation, and a new queen whose family would compete with the Nevilles for royal favour. Elizabeth's coronation as queen in May 1465 was a magnificent affair designed to demonstrate Edward's complete commitment to his controversial marriage choice. The ceremony at Westminster Abbey was attended by all the great nobles of the realm, many of whom had serious reservations about the new queen, but were compelled by political necessity to show appropriate respect. Elizabeth's dignity and grace during these public appearances helped to win over some initial skeptics, but her elevation remained a source of ongoing tension. The political consequences of Edward's marriage became apparent almost immediately, as Elizabeth's extensive family network began seeking advancement through their connection to the Queen. Elizabeth was one of 13 children, and her siblings represented a large pool of potential competitors for the offices, estates, and marriage alliances that formed the currency of medieval politics. This Woodville advancement inevitably came at the expense of established Yorkist supporters, creating resentment that would eventually explode into open rebellion. The marriage arrangements made for Elizabeth's sisters proved particularly controversial, as they removed several of England's most eligible bachelors from the marriage market and redirected valuable inheritances toward the Woodville family. Catherine Woodville's marriage to Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, was especially resented because it bound one of England's most powerful nobles to the Queen's family rather than allowing him to choose his own political alliances. Warwick's growing alienation from Edward was intensified by the king's foreign policy decisions, which consistently favoured Burgundy over France, despite the Earl's strong preference for a French alliance. Edward's support for Burgundy was partly influenced by commercial considerations. The Burgundian Netherlands were England's most important trading partner, but it was also connected to his marriage choice, as the Woodville family had Burgundian connections through Elizabeth's mother. The depth of Warwick's resentment became apparent in his treatment of Elizabeth's father, Richard Woodville, whom Edward had elevated to Earl Rivers. Despite this noble rank, Warwick consistently treated Rivers with the contempt he felt was due to an upstart commoner who had presumed to elevate himself above his proper station. This personal animosity reflected broader tensions about social mobility and the proper relationship between established nobility and royal favourites. Edward's brother George, Duke of Clarence, found himself increasingly attracted to Warwick's opposition. Party, as his own position within the royal family, was threatened by Edward's growing reliance on Woodville advisers. Clarence had initially been Edward's heir presumptive, but the king's marriage raised the possibility that Elizabeth might produce sons who would displace him in the succession. His resentment was further inflamed by Edward's refusal to allow him to marry Warwick's elder daughter, Isabel Neville. The international implications of Edward's marriage choice became apparent as foreign powers began to reassess their relationships with the Yorkist regime. Louis XV of France, in particular, saw an opportunity to exploit the growing division within the Yorkist camp by encouraging Warwick's opposition to Edward's pro-Burgundian policies. The French king's willingness to provide support for Warwick's eventual rebellion would prove crucial in the dramatic events that followed. Elizabeth's own role in these developing tensions was complex and often misunderstood by contemporary observers. While she certainly promoted her family's interests and expected appropriate respect for her royal status, she was not the scheming manipulator that her enemies portrayed. Instead, she was an intelligent woman, trying to navigate the treacherous waters of medieval court politics while protecting her children from her first marriage and establishing security for any future offspring. The birth of Elizabeth's first child by Edward, a daughter named Elizabeth of York, in February 1466, temporarily eased some tensions by demonstrating the fertility of the royal marriage. However, the princess's gender meant that the succession question remained open, while her very existence served as a reminder to Clarence and other potential heirs that their positions were becoming increasingly precarious. By 1467, the Yorkist coalition that had seemed so united at Towton was fracturing along multiple fault lines created or exacerbated by Edward's marriage. Warwick's opposition was becoming more open, Clarence's resentment was growing more dangerous, and foreign powers were beginning to see opportunities for intervention. The love match that had brought Edward personal happiness was transforming into the political crisis that would define the remainder of his reign. Richard Neville, later known as Warwick the Kingmaker, stood at the pinnacle of English nobility in the mid-1460s, wielding influence that rivaled kings and commanded resources that could make or break dynasties. His vast estate stretched across 20 counties, his network of retainers numbered in the thousands, and his political connections extended throughout Europe. Yet this man, who had placed Edward IV on the throne of England, would ultimately become his most dangerous enemy, driven by a combination of wounded pride, political calculation, and genuine belief that his former protégé had betrayed everything they had fought to achieve. The roots of Warwick's transformation from kingmaker to kingbreaker lay deep in the structure of medieval English society, where personal relationships between great nobles determined the fate of kingdoms. Warwick had not merely supported Edward's claim to the throne, he had been instrumental in creating it, providing the military expertise, financial resources, and political connections that made Yorkist victory possible. In return, he had expected to remain the primary influence on royal policy, the elder statesman who would guide the young king through the complexities of medieval governance. Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville shattered these expectations and revealed fundamental differences in how the two men understood their relationship. Where Warwick saw himself as the senior partner in a political alliance, Edward viewed himself as a king who might consult advisors but would make his own decisions. The marriage was not just a personal choice, but a declaration of independence that challenged the very foundations of Warwick's influence. The Earl's wounded pride was intensified by the manner in which Edward had concealed the marriage during months of negotiations for foreign alliances. Warwick had invested enormous time and political capital in discussions with French representatives about a potential marriage between Edward and a sister-in-law of Louis XV. These negotiations had proceeded to advanced stages, with Warwick personally guaranteeing Edward's commitment to the proposed match. The revelation of the secret marriage made Warwick appear either incompetent or dishonest, damaging his reputation throughout Europe. Warwick's anger was not merely personal, but reflected deeper concerns about the direction of Yorkist policy under Edward's independent rule. The elevation of the Woodville family threatened to displace the Nevilles as the primary beneficiaries of royal favour, while Edward's pro-Burgundian foreign policy conflicted with Warwick's preference for a French alliance. These disagreements involved fundamental questions about England's international relationships and domestic power structure that could not be easily compromised. The Earl's opposition to Edward's policies became increasingly open during 1467 and 1468, as he used his positions as Captain of Calais and Admiral of England to pursue policies that directly contradicted royal instructions. His authorization of piratical attacks on Burgundian shipping was particularly provocative, representing a direct challenge to Edward's diplomatic efforts and demonstrating Warwick's willingness to use his independent power base against the crown. Edward's response to these provocations revealed his own political maturation and his determination not to be overshadowed by overmighty subjects. Rather than accommodating Warwick's concerns, the king moved systematically to reduce the Earl's influence by promoting alternative power centres and building new alliances that did not depend on Neville's support. The dismissal of Warwick's brother George, Neville, from the chancellorship in 1467 sent a clear message that the era of Neville dominance was ending. The involvement of George, Duke of Clarence, in Warwick's growing opposition movement added a dangerous dynastic dimension to what might otherwise have remained a dispute between king and subject. Clarence's marriage to Warwick's daughter Isabel Neville in July 1469, conducted without royal permission and in direct defiance of Edward's wishes, represented a formal alliance between the king's brother and his most powerful subject against the crown itself. Warwick's rebellion in the summer of 1469 demonstrated both his continued political influence and his sophisticated understanding of propaganda warfare. The manifesto issued in his name and that of Clarence portrayed their uprising not as treason against the lawful king, but as a necessary intervention to save Edward from evil counsellors who had led him astray. This approach allowed them to maintain the fiction of loyalty to the crown, while justifying armed resistance to royal policies. The Battle of Edgecote Moor in July 1469 revealed that Warwick retained formidable military capabilities despite his alienation from the court. His victory over a royal army commanded by the Earl of Pembroke demonstrated that Edward's regime was more vulnerable than its recent successes had suggested. More importantly, the battle eliminated several key supporters of the Woodville faction, including the Queen's father Earl Rivers and her brother Sir John Woodville, whose executions after the battle showed that the gloves were now off in the struggle between Warwick and Edward. Edward's capture following Edgecote placed him temporarily at Warwick's mercy, creating a situation that paralleled his father's control over Henry VI after the First Battle of St. Albans. However, Edward proved a more resilient prisoner than Henry had been, maintaining his dignity and royal authority even while under constraint. His refusal to be manipulated or humiliated by his captors demonstrated the personal strength that would ultimately enable him to overcome this crisis. Warwick's inability to maintain control over the kingdom during Edward's captivity revealed the limitations of his position. Unlike Henry VI, whose mental incapacity had created a genuine need for alternative leadership, Edward remained intellectually capable and politically legitimate. Warwick found himself in the impossible position of trying to rule through a king who actively opposed his policies while lacking any legal basis for replacing Edward with a more compliant alternative. The release of Edward in late 1469 marked the beginning of the final phase of his conflict with Warwick, as both men prepared for a showdown that could only end in the complete victory of one side or the other. Edward's apparent willingness to forgive his brother and former ally disguised a systematic campaign to isolate them politically and militarily, while Warwick's reciprocal reconciliation concealed preparations for a more decisive rebellion that would either destroy Edward or force him into permanent exile. The Lincolnshire Rising of early 1470 provided the pretext for the final confrontation between Edward and Warwick. The rebellion, while ostensibly spontaneous, bore clear signs of Warwick's orchestration and was intended to create the conditions for a larger uprising that would finally overthrow Edward's regime. However, Edward's rapid and decisive response to the Lincolnshire threat demonstrated that he had learned from his earlier mistakes and was prepared to act with the ruthlessness necessary to preserve his crown. The crushing defeat of the Lincolnshire rebels at the Battle of Empingham, where Edward's forces routed their enemies so thoroughly that the engagement became known as Wakefield Field, marked the effective end of Warwick's position in England. The Earl's flight to France with Clarence represented the failure of his attempt to control English politics from within the system, and his transformation into an exile dependent on foreign support for any hope of returning to power. Louis XV, of France's warm reception of Warwick and Clarence, reflected the French king's sophisticated understanding of English politics and his desire to exploit any opportunity to weaken his Burgundian enemies. By providing sanctuary and support for Edward's opponents, Louis was pursuing a foreign policy that had the potential to transform the balance of power in Western Europe while requiring relatively modest French investment. The most remarkable aspect of Warwick's exile was his eventual reconciliation with Margaret of Anjou, the queen he had spent years trying to destroy, and whose husband he had repeatedly defeated and captured. This alliance, brokered by Louis XV and sealed by the betrothal of Warwick's younger daughter Anne Neville to Margaret's son Edward of Westminster, represented one of the most cynical political arrangements in medieval history. The terms of the Warwick-Margaret alliance revealed the desperation of both parties and the extent to which personal animosities had been subordinated to political necessity. Margaret agreed to accept the man, who had been responsible for her family's downfall, as her primary ally, while Warwick committed himself to restoring the dynasty he had fought to overthrow. Neither could have imagined such an alliance a decade earlier, but the logic of opposition to Edward IV had created strange bedfellows indeed. Warwick's invasion of England in September 1470 marked the beginning of the most dramatic phase of his career, as the exile who had been written off by most observers suddenly found himself within reach of ultimate victory. His success in forcing Edward into flight and restoring Henry VI to the throne represented the triumph of political calculation over seemingly impossible odds, demonstrating that even the most established regime could be vulnerable to a well-planned and expertly executed challenge. The cold morning of April 14, 1471, brought with it a thick mist that seemed to blanket the fields around Barnet like a shroud, creating an atmosphere both mysterious and ominous as two armies prepared to settle the fate of England in what would prove to be one of the most decisive battles in the entire Wars of the Roses. The irony was profound. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the man who had twice made and unmade kings, was about to face his former protégé Edward IV in a confrontation that would determine not only the immediate future of the English crown, but the ultimate trajectory of the dynastic conflict that had consumed the kingdom for nearly 2 decades. Edward's return from exile in Burgundy had been nothing short of miraculous, transforming him from a defeated fugitive into a conquering hero in less than a month. Landing at Ravenspur on March 14, 1471, with a force of perhaps 2,000 men, he had initially claimed only to be seeking restoration of his Duchy of York, rather than the crown itself. This calculated deception allowed nervous nobles to support him without committing outright treason against the restored Henry VI, while Edward secretly planned the systematic recovery of his kingdom. The speed of Edward's advance through England demonstrated both his political skill and the underlying weakness of the Lancastrian restoration. Henry VI's return to the throne in 1470 had been engineered by Warwick rather than generated by popular enthusiasm, and the brief period of the readaptation had failed to establish the kind of broad-based support necessary for sustained resistance to a Yorkist revival. Many nobles who had reluctantly accepted Lancastrian rule were quietly relieved by Edward's return and proved willing to abandon Warwick when the opportunity presented itself. The crucial turning point in Edward's return came with the defection of his brother George, Duke of Clarence, who abandoned his alliance with Warwick and reconciled with Edward near Coventry. This betrayal was devastating for Warwick both personally and strategically, as Clarence brought with him not only his own military forces, but also intelligence about Lancastrian dispositions and plans. The reunion of the royal brothers, emotional and politically calculated in equal measure, demonstrated Edward's willingness to forgive when forgiveness served his interests. Edward's entry into London on April 11, 1471, was greeted with genuine enthusiasm by the city's population, who had suffered economically during the brief Lancastrian restoration and hoped that Edward's return would bring renewed stability and prosperity. The immediate recapture of Henry VI, found abandoned by his supporters in the Bishop of London's palace, provided Edward with a crucial advantage. He once again controlled the person of the legitimate Lancastrian king, a position that gave him both moral authority and strategic flexibility. The Battle of Barnet itself began in the early hours of Easter Sunday, with both armies deploying in the darkness and mist that would ultimately determine the battle's outcome. Edward's forces, positioned on higher ground near Barnet town, numbered perhaps 15,000 men, while Warwick's army was slightly larger, but suffered from uncertain morale and questionable loyalty among some contingents. The Earl had made the crucial decision to fight on foot, alongside his men, abandoning the medieval tradition of mounted commanders who could flee if battle turned against them. The thick fog that shrouded the battlefield that morning proved to be both a tactical hindrance and a strategic factor that would ultimately determine the battle's outcome. Unable to see more than a few yards in any direction, the two armies advanced toward each other in the pre-dawn darkness, their positions slightly misaligned due to the poor visibility. This misalignment meant that the two armies overlapped at both ends, with each side's right wing extending beyond their opponent's left wing. The initial clash was fierce and confused, as men fought blindly in the fog, unable to distinguish friend from enemy except at close range. The Earl of Oxford, commanding Warwick's right wing, achieved early success by routing the Yorkist left under Lord Hastings, pursuing the defeated troops through the fog in what appeared to be the beginning of a Lancastrian victory. However, Oxford's absence from the main battlefield would prove crucial in the disaster that followed. The fighting in the centre and on the Yorkist right continued, with neither side gaining decisive advantage, as men stumbled through the fog, striking at shadows and falling to unseen blows. Edward, fighting in the thick of the combat as was his custom, personally rallied his troops and maintained the cohesion of his battle line despite the chaos and limited visibility. His physical courage and leadership by example would prove crucial in sustaining Yorkist morale during the most critical phase of the battle. The catastrophe that would decide the battle came when Oxford's troops, having reformed after their initial victory, attempted to rejoin the main engagement. Approaching through the fog, they were mistaken for Yorkist reinforcements by their own side, as the star badge worn by Oxford's men resembled Edward's son in splendour badge in the limited visibility. Lancastrian archers, believing they faced fresh enemy troops, loosed volleys into Oxford's ranks, killing many and creating panic that quickly spread through the Lancastrian lines. The cry of treason that went up from Oxford's troops as they realized they were being attacked by their own side had a devastating psychological effect on the entire Lancastrian army. Medieval warfare depended heavily on trust and cohesion, and the belief that treachery was occurring within their own ranks shattered the Lancastrian will to continue fighting. Oxford himself, convinced that deliberate betrayal was afoot, fled the field with his surviving followers, removing one of Warwick's most capable commanders from the battle. The collapse of Lancastrian morale following the friendly fire incident gave Edward the opportunity he needed to press his advantage. The Yorkist forces, sensing victory within their grasp, renewed their assault with increased ferocity, driving their disorganized opponents backward through the fog. What had been a closely contested battle transformed into a rout as Lancastrian cohesion disintegrated and individual soldiers sought only to escape the slaughter. Warwick's death in the final phase of the battle carried its own tragic irony. The man who had spent his life striving to control English politics died trying to reach his horse and flee a battle that was already lost. Contemporary accounts differ on the precise circumstances of his end, with some suggesting he was cut down by pursuing Yorkists, while others claim he was deliberately killed by men seeking revenge for past injuries. What is certain is that the Kingmaker died ingloriously, his body stripped and later displayed in St. Paul's Cathedral, to prove that the man who had made and unmade kings was truly dead. The carnage at Barnet exceeded even the terrible standards established at Towton a decade earlier. with estimates suggesting over 4,000 men died in the fog-shrouded fields that Easter morning. The bodies of the fallen lay so thick upon the ground that burial parties worked for days to clear the battlefield, while the wounded filled every available space in Barnet town and the surrounding villages. The battle had settled nothing except that Edward remained king, while the Lancastrian cause now depended entirely on Margaret of Anjou and her son Edward of Westminster. Margaret's landing at Weymouth on the very day of the Battle of Barnet represented both terrible timing and missed opportunity. Had she arrived even a week earlier, the combined Lancastrian forces might have overwhelmed Edward's army. Instead, she found herself confronting a victorious king who controlled London and possessed the momentum that victory brings to medieval warfare. Her only hope lay in reaching the traditional Lancastrian strongholds in Wales, where she might gather sufficient forces to challenge Edward's supremacy. The race to the Severn that followed Barnet became one of the most dramatic pursuits in English military history, as Margaret's army desperately sought to cross into Wales, while Edward's forces pursued them relentlessly, determined to bring them to battle before they could reach safety. Both armies were exhausted, having marched over 200 miles in less than 3 weeks, but Edward recognized that allowing Margaret to escape meant prolonging the war indefinitely. Edward's forced marches during this pursuit demonstrated his exceptional stamina and his soldiers' devotion to their king. Contemporary accounts record single-day marches of over 40 miles, extraordinary distances for medieval armies burdened with armor and supplies. The king's willingness to share these hardships with his men, sleeping rough and eating the same provisions as common soldiers, reinforced the loyalty and morale that would prove crucial in the battle to come. The Battle of Tewkesbury on May 4, 1471, began with both sides exhausted from their respective marches, but understanding that this engagement would likely determine the final outcome of the Lancastrian cause. Margaret's forces, numbering perhaps 6,000 men, had been unable to cross the Severn before Edward caught up with them, forcing them to fight with their backs to the river, and no realistic possibility of retreat if the battle turned against them. Edward's tactical deployment at Tewkesbury showed the military sophistication he had developed through years of warfare. He positioned his forces to take advantage of the terrain while blocking all escape routes for the Lancastrian army. The presence of the Duke of Gloucester, Edward's youngest brother, and the future Richard III, commanding a division for the first time, added another dimension to Yorkist strength and provided valuable experience for a young commander who would later need every skill he acquired. The Lancastrian assault on the Yorkist positions demonstrated the desperate courage of men who understood they were fighting for their lives and their cause's survival. The Duke of Somerset led his troops in a flanking attack that initially achieved some success, but Edward's tactical reserves and superior positioning eventually contained and repulsed the Lancastrian assault. The fighting was particularly savage, characterized by the fury of men who knew that defeat meant death rather than captivity. The death of Edward of Westminster, Prince of Wales, marked the effective end of the direct Lancastrian line, and with it the extinction of the cause for which thousands had died over 16 years of civil war. The circumstances of the prince's death remain disputed. Some accounts suggest he was killed in battle, others that he was murdered after capture while pleading for mercy. What is certain is that Margaret of Anjou's son, the heir for whom she had fought so desperately, died at Tewkesbury, destroying the last realistic hope of Lancastrian restoration. The aftermath of Tewkesbury witnessed scenes of carnage that shocked even the hardened veterans of the Wars of the Roses, as victorious Yorkist troops pursued defeated enemies into Tewkesbury Abbey, violating the sanctuary that should have protected fugitives. The resulting massacre, while later glossed over by official accounts, represented yet another breakdown of the chivalric codes that were supposed to govern medieval warfare. The capture of Margaret of Anjou herself, discovered hiding in a religious house after the battle, represented the final humiliation for the woman who had once been England's most powerful queen, the she-wolf of France, who had led armies and defied kings, was reduced to a captive dependent on her enemy's mercy. Edward's decision to keep her prisoner rather than execute her reflected both political calculation and perhaps a residual respect for her royal status, though her captivity would be long and her circumstances reduced. The murder of Henry VI in the Tower of London during the night of May 21st, 1471, eliminated the last obstacle to Edward's complete control of England. Official accounts claim the deposed king died of pure displeasure and melancholy upon hearing of his son's death, but few contemporaries believed this transparent fiction. The responsibility for Henry's death, whether Edward ordered it directly or merely gave tacit approval, would haunt the Yorkist regime and provide propaganda material for future opposition. The twin victories at Barnet and Tewkesbury, achieved within 3 weeks of each other, marked the effective end of the first phase of the Wars of the Roses. The House of Lancaster's male line was extinct, its most capable leaders dead or in exile, and its figurehead queen imprisoned. Edward IV appeared to have finally secured the throne that his father had died pursuing, while the kingdom could look forward to an extended period of peace after nearly 2 decades of civil war. Yet the seeds of future conflict had already been planted in the very victories that seemed to ensure Yorkist supremacy. The executions and murders that followed Tewkesbury created new grievances that would eventually demand satisfaction, while Edward's own choices in marriage and governance would create new fault lines in the Yorkist coalition. The Wars of the Roses were far from over, though the combatants and causes would evolve in ways that few could have predicted in the aftermath of Edward's triumph. The 12 years following Edward IV's victories at Barnet and Tewkesbury represented the most successful period of his reign, a time when the young warrior king transformed himself into an effective administrator, and England enjoyed a prosperity and stability that had been absent since the days of Henry V. Yet these golden years were also marked by tensions and decisions that would ultimately undermine everything Edward had achieved and plunge England back into dynastic conflict within months of his death. Edward's approach to governance during his second reign reflected hard lessons learned from the turbulent years that preceded it, where he had once relied heavily on overmighty subjects like Warwick. He now worked systematically to centralize royal authority and reduce the independence of the great nobles who might challenge his rule. This policy of controlled centralization represented a significant evolution in English royal government and anticipated the more absolute monarchy that would develop under the Tudors. The king's financial administration during this period demonstrated particular sophistication, as Edward worked to restore royal finances that had been devastated by years of civil war. Rather than relying solely on parliamentary taxation, which required the consent of often reluctant commons, Edward developed alternative revenue sources including profitable commercial ventures, careful management of crown lands, and the controversial benevolences, supposedly voluntary loans that were in practice compulsory contributions from wealthy subjects. Edward's commercial activities, while sometimes criticized by contemporaries as undignified for a monarch, reflected his pragmatic approach to kingship and his understanding that royal authority ultimately depended on financial independence. His investments in trading ventures, his loans to merchants at favorable terms, and his active involvement in commercial policy made him perhaps the most business-minded monarch England had known, anticipating the economic sophistication that would characterize later English government. The relationship between Edward and Elizabeth Woodville deepened during these years as the Queen finally provided the male heirs that were essential for dynastic security. The birth of Edward, Prince of Wales, in 1470, had been overshadowed by the political crisis that briefly cost Edward his throne, but the subsequent births of Richard in 1473 and other children established a Yorkist succession that seemed secure from challenge. Elizabeth's transformation from controversial royal bride to respected Queen Mother paralleled her husband's own evolution from warrior to statesman. The Woodville family's continued advancement during Edward's second reign remained a source of tension among the established nobility, though the king's greater authority and the elimination of rival power centres reduced the immediate danger of noble rebellion. Elizabeth's relatives occupied key positions in government, the church, and the royal household, creating a network of Woodville influence that would prove both an asset during Edward's lifetime and a vulnerability after his death. Edward's relationship with his brothers during this period revealed the complex family dynamics that would ultimately contribute to the regime's downfall. George, Duke of Clarence, had been forgiven for his alliance with Warwick and restored to royal favour, but his behaviour grew increasingly erratic and troublesome as the 1470s progressed. His marriage to Warwick's daughter Isabel had given him a sense of entitlement to the entire Warwick inheritance, bringing him into conflict with his younger brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who had married Warwick's younger daughter Anne. The dispute between Clarence and Gloucester over the Warwick estates consumed much of Edward's attention during the mid-1470s and revealed the limitations of royal authority even in a period of relative stability. Edward's attempts to mediate between his brothers satisfied neither, while creating lasting resentment that would influence their behaviour in the succession crisis that followed his death. The king's eventual decision to favour Gloucester, who had proven consistently loyal, over the unpredictable Clarence established a precedent that would have fatal consequences. Clarence's execution in 1478, following his conviction for treason by a parliament that he was not allowed to address, represented the darkest episode of Edward's second reign and a decision that would haunt the royal family. The charges against Clarence, spreading rumours about Edward's illegitimacy, plotting rebellion and other crimes, may have been substantially true, but the manner of his death and the king's personal involvement in his brother's condemnation shocked contemporaries and undermined the fraternal loyalty that had been one of the Yorkist dynasty's strengths. The legendary manner of Clarence's death, drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine according to later tradition, added a grotesque element to an already tragic story. Whether this account is true or represents embellishment of a more mundane execution, it captured contemporary imagination and became permanently associated with the Duke's memory. Edward's decision to execute his own brother demonstrated the ruthlessness that his generally affable nature often concealed, and his willingness to eliminate threats to his regime regardless of family ties. Edward's foreign policy during his second reign focused primarily on managing the complex relationship with Burgundy and France, the two continental powers whose rivalry provided both opportunities and dangers for English interests. His invasion of France in 1475, initially planned as a renewal of the 100 Years' War and a reclamation of England's lost French territories, ended instead with the Treaty of Picquigny, a diplomatic settlement that provided Edward with a substantial pension from Louis XVII in exchange for abandoning military action. The Treaty of Picquigny was controversial among English nobility, who had expected glorious victories and profitable conquests, rather than a pension arrangement that some characterized as a bribe. However, Edward's pragmatic approach reflected his understanding that England lacked the resources for sustained continental warfare, and that the French pension provided reliable income without the costs and risks of military campaigns. This diplomatic settlement marked a significant departure from traditional English foreign policy, and acknowledged the end of realistic English aspirations to French territories. Edward's cultural patronage during his second reign reflected his desire to establish the Yorkist dynasty as not merely militarily successful, but culturally sophisticated. His support for William Caxton's printing press, his collection of illuminated manuscripts, his rebuilding of St. George's Chapel at Windsor, and his general encouragement of learning and the arts demonstrated that he understood monarchy required cultural as well as political legitimacy. These activities also provided employment and status for artists and scholars who helped create the propaganda necessary for sustained dynastic rule. The king's personal life during these years continued to combine official dignity with private indulgence. As Edward's reputation for womanizing persisted despite his marriage and his advancing age, his numerous mistresses, including the famous Jane Shore, were generally tolerated by Queen Elizabeth, who understood that royal marriages were political arrangements that did not preclude other relationships. However, these liaisons did create vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit and contributed to later accusations of moral weakness. Edward's increasing corpulence during the 1480s reflected both the prosperity of his reign and his own indulgent lifestyle. Contemporary accounts describe him growing fat and lazy, spending more time in pleasure and less in the active pursuits that had characterized his youth. This physical decline may have contributed to the sudden illness that would kill him at the relatively young age of 40, leaving his kingdom and dynasty vulnerable at the very moment when his long reign seemed to have established permanent Yorkist rule. The king's arrangements for succession demonstrated both his confidence in the stability he had created and his failure to anticipate the dangers that would emerge after his death. Edward assumed that his son, the young Edward V, would succeed smoothly to the throne with guidance from a regency council that included both Woodvilles and traditional nobility. This optimistic vision failed to account for the ambitions, grievances, and conflicts that his own policies had created and that would explode in the succession crisis that followed his death. Edward's sudden death in April 1483, possibly from pneumonia or typhoid, came without warning and found the kingdom unprepared for the transition of power. The vigorous king, who had dominated English politics for over 2 decades, was gone, leaving behind a 12-year-old heir, a divided nobility, a court faction structure that had been held together primarily by Edward's personal authority, and a younger brother whose loyalty and ambitions remained uncertain. The golden years of peace and prosperity were about to give way to the final brutal phase of the Wars of the Roses. The death of Edward IV in April 1483 shattered the carefully constructed stability that had characterized his second reign, plunging England into a succession crisis that would become one of the most controversial episodes in English history. Within 3 months of the old king's death, his son Edward IV would be deposed, 2 young princes would disappear into the Tower of London, and Richard III would claim the crown through means that would forever blacken his reputation and provide his enemies with powerful propaganda weapons. Edward, later known briefly as King Edward V, was just 12 years old when news of his father's death reached him at Ludlow Castle, where he had been serving as nominal Prince of Wales under the tutelage of his maternal uncle, Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers. The young prince had been carefully educated for kingship, learning languages, military skills, and the arts of government, but nothing could have prepared him for the whirlwind of events that would engulf him in the months following his father's death. The initial arrangements for the young king's succession seemed straightforward enough. Edward V would travel from Ludlow to London for his coronation, accompanied by a moderate escort and joined along the way by the leading nobles of the realm. His father's will had appointed Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as Lord Protector during the new king's minority, a role that gave Richard authority but not unlimited power. The Woodville family, through their control of the young king and their positions in government, expected to remain influential during the regency. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, later known as King Richard III, was at Middleham Castle in Yorkshire when he received news of his brother's death. At 30 years old, he was an experienced administrator and military commander who had served Edward IV loyally, particularly in the government of Northern England, where he had earned a reputation for justice and capable leadership. His marriage to Anne Neville, daughter of Warwick the Kingmaker, had given him substantial estates and a connection to one of England's most powerful noble families. The circumstances of Richard's interception of the young king's party at Stony Stratford marked the beginning of the crisis that would end in usurpation. Richard, coordinating with Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, arrested Earl Rivers and other Woodville supporters who accompanied Edward V, claiming they were plotting to exclude him from his rightful role as protector. Whether this Woodville plot was real or imagined remains debated, but Richard's actions demonstrated his determination to control the person of the young king and thereby the government of England. Edward V's reaction to his uncle's coup revealed both the young king's political awareness and his helplessness in the face of adult machinations. Contemporary accounts describe him protesting the arrests of his maternal relatives and asserting his royal authority, but his age and isolation rendered these protests meaningless. Richard's control over the physical person of the king gave him effective power, regardless of legal niceties about protectorship and regency arrangements. The escort of Edward V to London under Richard's control transformed the young king from an independent monarch into a virtual prisoner, though this reality was carefully disguised by formal shows of respect and deference. Richard's initial public statements emphasized his loyalty to his brother's son and his intention to preserve the Yorkist succession, but his actions in arresting Woodville supporters and seizing control of government suggested more ambitious plans. The decision to house Edward V in the Tower of London was presented as a temporary arrangement necessary for security and preparation for the coronation, as the Tower served as a traditional residence for monarchs before their crowning. However, the Tower was also England's most secure prison, and Edward's residence there would gradually transform from royal accommodation into permanent captivity. The young king's initial stay in the royal apartments would eventually lead to his disappearance into the Tower's darker recesses. Richard's escalating actions during May and June 1483 revealed his progression from protector, seeking to maintain order, to potential usurper, preparing to claim the throne himself. The arrest and execution of Lord Hastings, one of Edward IV's most trusted advisers, on charges of plotting against Richard, demonstrated the protector's willingness to eliminate opposition through judicial murder. Hastings's summary execution, carried out immediately after his arrest without proper trial, shocked the nobility and suggested that Richard had moved beyond legal constraints. The emergence of claims about Edward IV's invalid marriage provided Richard with the legal pretext he needed for usurpation, though the timing and nature of these claims raised obvious questions about their legitimacy. Robert Stillington, Bishop of Bath and Wells, came forward to claim that Edward IV had been secretly pre-contracted to marry Eleanor Butler before his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, rendering the Woodville marriage bigamous and all children of that union illegitimate. This revelation, true or false, provided a legal basis for excluding Edward V from the succession. The implications of the pre-contract allegation extended beyond the immediate succession crisis to strike at the heart of Edward II's entire reign. If the marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid, then not only was Edward V illegitimate, but so were all of his siblings, including the popular Elizabeth of York. This taint of illegitimacy would complicate the succession for years to come and provide future opponents with arguments against Yorkist legitimacy. Parliament's acceptance of these claims through the document known as Titulus Regius represented either genuine belief in the evidence presented or pragmatic recognition that Richard controlled sufficient military force to take the throne regardless of legal justification. The assembly that declared Edward V illegitimate and offered the crown to Richard included many of the same nobles who had sworn loyalty to Edward IV and his heirs, demonstrating the flexible nature of medieval political allegiance when faced with superior force. Richard's coronation as Richard III on July 6, 1483, was conducted with full traditional ceremony, emphasizing continuity and legitimacy, even as the circumstances of his accession undermined both. The presence of his wife Anne Neville as Queen and their son Edward as Prince of Wales created the appearance of a stable succession, while the absence of Edward V and his brother created an increasingly troubling question about their fate. The transfer of Edward V's younger brother Richard, Duke of York, from sanctuary at Westminster Abbey to join his brother in the Tower, represented another troubling development in the unfolding tragedy. Elizabeth Woodville had sought sanctuary for her younger son, recognizing the danger he faced, but pressure from Richard III eventually forced her to surrender the boy to his uncle's custody. The reunion of the two princes in the Tower would prove to be not a fraternal comfort, but a prelude to their disappearance. The prince's gradual disappearance from public view during the summer of 1483 created speculation and rumour that have persisted for over 5 centuries. Initial reports placed them playing in the Tower gardens, and occasionally visible at windows gradually gave way to accounts of their withdrawal to inner chambers, and finally to complete absence from public sight. Whether they were moved to private apartments for legitimate security reasons or murdered on Richard's orders remains one of history's most debated mysteries. The most damning account of the prince's fate came from Thomas More's history, written decades later during the Tudor period, and based on testimony from individuals who claimed knowledge of the events. More's narrative describes Sir James Tyrrell acting on Richard's orders to murder the princes in their beds, with the bodies subsequently buried at the foot of a staircase in the Tower. While More's account has been challenged as Tudor propaganda, it established the version of events that most people believed and that Shakespeare would later dramatize. The discovery of 2 children's skeletons during renovations to the Tower in 1674, buried roughly where More's account suggested, seemed to confirm the traditional narrative of murder, though modern analysis of these remains has proven inconclusive. Whether these bones belong to the princes, to other children who died in the Tower, or to individuals from a different era entirely remains scientifically uncertain, though they have been treated as the prince's remains and reburied in Westminster Abbey. The political impact of the prince's disappearance, regardless of its cause, proved catastrophic for Richard III's regime. Even contemporaries who had supported his accession began to question their loyalty when faced with the likelihood that he had murdered his nephews to secure his throne. The stain of suspected child murder would haunt Richard throughout his brief reign and provide powerful motivation for nobles seeking to justify rebellion against his rule. The emergence of opposition to Richard's rule, led by former Yorkist supporters including the Duke of Buckingham, demonstrated how completely the usurpation had fractured the political coalition that Edward IV had built. Buckingham's rebellion in October 1483, though quickly suppressed, showed that Richard faced opposition not just from Lancastrian remnants, but from within the Yorkist party itself. The Duke's eventual execution marked another chapter in the cycle of violence that consumed the Wars of the Roses. The transformation of Henry Tudor from obscure exile to legitimate alternative to Richard III reflected both the desperation of Richard's opponents and the complete extinction of more direct Lancastrian claimants. Henry's claim to the throne, through his mother Margaret Beaufort's descent from John of Gaunt, was legally dubious and had been explicitly barred from the succession by earlier parliamentary act. Yet in the absence of any other viable Lancastrian candidate and facing a Yorkist king suspected of murdering children, Henry's weak claim seemed preferable to continued Ricardian rule. The prince's fate, whether death or disappearance, marked the effective end of the direct male line descended from Edward IV and created the succession vacuum that would lead to the final confrontation at Bosworth Field. Their story became emblematic of the Wars of the Roses' capacity for consuming even the innocent, transforming royal children from symbols of hope and continuity into victims of political ambition and dynastic conflict. The summer of 1485 brought with it a sense of inevitability, as Henry Tudor's invasion fleet gathered in French ports and Richard III prepared his defences, both men understanding that their confrontation would determine not just the immediate possession of England's crown, but the ultimate resolution of the dynastic conflict that had consumed the kingdom for 30 years. The stage was set for the final dramatic act in the Wars of the Roses, a battle that would end one dynasty, establish another, and transform the nature of English monarchy. The summer of 1485 brought with it a sense of inevitability, as Henry Tudor's invasion fleet gathered in French ports and Richard III prepared his defences, both men understanding that their confrontation would determine not just the immediate possession of England's crown, but the ultimate resolution of the dynastic conflict that had consumed the kingdom for 30 years. The stage was set for the final dramatic act in the Wars of the Roses, a battle that would end one dynasty, establish another, and transform the nature of English monarchy. Henry, later known as King Henry VII, had spent most of his life in exile, first in Brittany and later in France, a fugitive from Yorkist vengeance, whose very survival seemed miraculous given the systematic elimination of Lancastrian claimants that had characterized Edward IV's reign. Born in 1457 at Pembroke Castle during the height of Yorkist ascendancy, Henry had been taken into exile as a child and raised far from the throne he would one day claim, his education in survival and political calculation more valuable than any formal training in kingship. Henry's mother, Margaret Beaufort, had devoted her considerable intelligence and energy to promoting her son's claim despite its legal weaknesses and the dangers such advocacy entailed. Her descent from John of Gaunt through the legitimised Beaufort line provided Henry's only connection to English royalty, a connection that had been explicitly excluded from succession rights when the Beauforts were legitimised. Yet Margaret's persistence, her careful cultivation of relationships with potential supporters, and her willingness to work with former enemies would prove crucial in building the coalition that would ultimately place her son on the throne. The transformation of Henry from obscure exile to viable claimant for the English throne resulted directly from Richard III's suspected murder of the princes in the Tower. This crime, whether real or merely believed, had created a moral outrage that transcended normal political calculations and made alliance with a weak Lancastrian claimant preferable to supporting a child-murdering Yorkist king. Henry's very weakness became a strength, as he posed little threat to the ambitions of greater nobles who might support him. The betrothal of Henry to Elizabeth of York, eldest daughter of Edward IV, represented the masterstroke that transformed his invasion from a Lancastrian revival into a genuine unification movement. This marriage promise, made in Christmas 1483, while Henry was still in exile, offered the prospect of ending the Wars of the Roses through dynastic union rather than continued conflict. Yorkist nobles who could never support a pure Lancastrian claim could rationalise supporting Henry if his victory would lead to marriage with their beloved Edward IV's daughter. Henry's landing at Milford Haven in Wales on August 7, 1485, with a force of perhaps 4,000 men, including French mercenaries and English exiles, represented an extraordinary gamble that his support in England was sufficient to overcome Richard's superior numbers and established position. The choice of Wales as landing site reflected both strategic calculation. Wales was distant from Richard's main strength in the Midlands and North, and symbolic appeal, as Henry could claim Welsh ancestry through his grandfather Owen Tudor and portray himself as the heir to ancient British kings. The march through Wales demonstrated Henry's political skill, as he successfully recruited Welsh supporters through a combination of ancestral appeals, promises of future rewards, and the general unpopularity of Richard's regime. The Red Dragon of Cadwallader that Henry displayed as his banner resonated with Welsh cultural identity, while also suggesting that his reign would mark a restoration of British greatness after centuries of English domination. These appeals proved effective enough to swell his army significantly, though it remained smaller than Richard's forces. Richard III's response to news of Henry's invasion revealed both his military competence and his political isolation. The king moved quickly to intercept Henry, gathering forces and marching to Leicester, but the response from his nobility was tepid at best and treasonous at worst. Many lords who had supported Edward IV proved reluctant to fight for his brother, while others actively conspired to betray Richard when the opportunity arose. The crucial question of Stanley's support dominated both sides' calculations as the armies approached their confrontation near Market Bosworth. Thomas Stanley, Lord Stanley, and his brother William Stanley commanded substantial forces that could determine the battle's outcome, but their loyalty remained uncertain. Lord Stanley was married to Henry's mother Margaret Beaufort, creating a family connection to the challenger, but he also held Richard's favour, and his son, George Stanley, Lord Strange, was effectively Richard's hostage, held to ensure his father's loyalty. Richard's decision to hold Lord Strange as hostage demonstrated his awareness of Stanley's uncertain loyalty, but this precaution ultimately proved insufficient to prevent betrayal. The Stanleys' failure to commit their forces to either side at the battle's beginning reflected their calculated decision to wait until the outcome seemed certain before declaring their allegiance, a pragmatic approach that minimized their risk while maximizing their potential reward. The Battle of Bosworth Field on August 22, 1485, began with Richard holding significant numerical advantage. His army numbered perhaps 12,000 to 15,000 men, while Henry's forces totaled perhaps 7,000, even counting Stanley forces whose commitment remained uncertain. Richard's position on Ambion Hill provided tactical advantage, and his experience as a military commander far exceeded Henry's minimal martial background. The initial engagement saw Richard's vanguard under the Duke of Norfolk advance against Henry's forces commanded by the Earl of Oxford, with the fighting quickly becoming intense as both sides recognized the stakes involved. Oxford's tactical skill and his troops' determination to overcome numerical disadvantage demonstrated that military calculations alone would not determine this battle's outcome, as morale and commitment proved equally crucial factors. The crucial failure of Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, to engage his forces on Richard's behalf marked the first major betrayal that would determine the battle's outcome. Whether Northumberland's inaction resulted from secret agreement with Henry, personal grievance against Richard, or simple calculation that the battle's outcome remained uncertain, his refusal to commit his substantial forces effectively neutralized Richard's numerical advantage and isolated the king's engaged troops. Richard's legendary charge toward Henry Tudor's position represented both supreme courage and supreme folly, as the king attempted to win the battle through personal combat with his rival. Contemporary accounts describe Richard having spotted Henry's standard and recognizing that his enemy was relatively exposed with only limited bodyguard, deciding to end the conflict through a decisive strike at the Tudor claimant himself. Leading his household knights in a desperate cavalry charge across the battlefield, Richard came remarkably close to success, personally killing Henry's standard-bearer William Brandon and unhorsing the experienced warrior John Cheney before the weight of numbers began to tell against him. The intervention of Sir William Stanley's forces at the crucial moment of Richard's charge proved decisive, as thousands of fresh troops smashed into the king's small band of household knights. Whether this intervention was prearranged with Henry or represented an opportunistic decision when Richard's position became exposed remains debated, but its effect was undeniable. Richard's charge was stopped, surrounded, and overwhelmed by superior numbers. Richard's death in the final moments of the battle carried a tragic nobility that even his enemies acknowledged, as the last Plantagenet king refused all opportunities to flee and instead fought to the end with a courage that contrasted sharply with the moral failings attributed to his reign. Contemporary witnesses reported that Richard fought like a man possessed, his battle cry of "treason, treason," echoing across the battlefield as he realized that betrayal had doomed his cause. His final moments, surrounded by enemies and still fighting despite hopeless odds, provided a dramatic ending that would inspire both historical record and literary imagination. The discovery of Richard's crown in a hawthorn bush after the battle, according to tradition, provided one of the most enduring images of the Wars of the Roses. Lord Stanley retrieving the circlet and placing it on Henry Tudor's head right there on the battlefield, symbolizing the immediate transfer of royal authority from defeated Yorkist to victorious Lancastrian. Whether this scene occurred exactly as tradition suggests or represents later embellishment, it captured the essential truth that Richard's death at Bosworth meant the end of the Plantagenet dynasty that had ruled England since 1154. The treatment of Richard's body after death demonstrated the complete breakdown of chivalric respect that had characterized the later stages of the Wars of the Roses. The dead king's naked corpse was displayed publicly in Leicester, slung over a horse like a common criminal, to prove beyond doubt that Richard III was truly dead and would never threaten his enemies again. This deliberate humiliation echoed the treatment of Richard, Duke of York's body after Wakefield, showing how the conflict had descended into cycles of revenge and degradation. The casualties at Bosworth, while lighter than at Towton or even Barnet, included much of the Yorkist nobility who had remained loyal to Richard III. The Duke of Norfolk died fighting for his king, while the Earl of Surrey was captured and imprisoned. The systematic elimination of Richard's closest supporters in the battle's aftermath ensured that any potential Yorkist resistance would lack leadership and coordination, though pockets of opposition would continue to emerge in the years that followed. Henry Tudor's immediate proclamation as Henry VII on the battlefield itself demonstrated his understanding that legitimacy in medieval England came from possession of power as much as from legal right. By claiming the crown immediately and dating his reign from the day before the battle, Henry retroactively made all of Richard's supporters traitors, whose lands and titles could be confiscated. This legal sleight of hand provided both punishment for enemies and rewards for supporters, while establishing Henry's position before any potential rivals could organize opposition. The new king's entry into London on September 3, 1485, was carefully staged to demonstrate both triumph and legitimacy, as Henry presented himself not as a foreign invader, but as England's rightful king who had reclaimed his inheritance from a usurper. The presence of captured Yorkist banners and the absence of excessive celebration or revenge suggested that Henry intended to be a unifying figure rather than a partisan conqueror, though his subsequent actions would demonstrate that mercy had clear limits. Henry's coronation on October 30th, 1485, deliberately preceded his marriage to Elizabeth of York, establishing that his claim to the throne rested on his own right rather than on his wife's Yorkist blood. This sequence was crucial for Henry's legitimacy, as he needed to demonstrate that he was king in his own right rather than merely Elizabeth's consort. The coronation's magnificence, while less elaborate than some predecessors, emphasized continuity with English royal tradition, while also marking the beginning of a new dynasty. The parliamentary ratification of Henry's kingship in November 1485 provided additional legal foundation for the Tudor claim, though the very fact that Parliament felt compelled to confirm what military victory had already established revealed the continuing uncertainty about succession rights. The Act of Parliament that confirmed Henry's title carefully avoided specifying the exact basis of his claim, recognizing that detailed examination would only highlight its weaknesses. The ultimate fulfillment of Henry's promise came with his marriage to Elizabeth of York on January 18, 1486, 5 months after his victory at Bosworth. This union of Lancaster and York, symbolized by the Tudor rose that combined red and white petals, represented the resolution through marriage of the dynastic conflict that warfare had failed to settle. Elizabeth's transformation from Yorkist princess to Tudor queen bridged the divide between rival houses and provided their future children with claims to both lineages. The birth of Arthur Tudor in September 1486 secured the succession and demonstrated the fertility of the Tudor union, while the choice of name deliberately invoked legendary British kingship and suggested that Henry's reign represented a return to ancient glories. The infant prince's birth at Winchester, supposedly the location of King Arthur's Camelot, reinforced these Arthurian associations and provided powerful propaganda for the new dynasty's legitimacy and destiny. Yet Bosworth had not ended all opposition to Tudor rule, as Yorkist pretenders and genuine claimants continued to emerge in the years following Henry's victory. The rebellion of Lambert Simnel in 1487, claiming to be Edward, Earl of Warwick, demonstrated that significant Yorkist sympathy remained, particularly in Ireland and among some English nobility. Henry's victory at the Battle of Stoke Field in June 1487 finally crushed this challenge and is sometimes considered the true end of the Wars of the Roses. The appearance of Perkin Warbeck in 1491, claiming to be Richard, Duke of York, one of the princes supposedly murdered in the Tower, represented an even more serious challenge to Tudor legitimacy. Warbeck's support from foreign powers including Scotland, Burgundy, and the Holy Roman Empire demonstrated that Henry's position remained vulnerable to dynastic challenges even years after Bosworth. The pretender's eventual capture and execution in 1499 removed this threat, but highlighted the continuing consequences of the prince's disappearance. Henry's systematic elimination of potential Yorkist claimants, including the execution of the genuine Earl of Warwick in 1499, demonstrated that the new king understood the dangers posed by any surviving males with Plantagenet blood. This ruthless pragmatism, while effective in securing Tudor rule, represented a continuation of the Wars of the Roses' brutal logic, even after the supposed end of the conflict. The battle's longer-term significance extended beyond immediate dynastic concerns to fundamental transformations in English political culture. The Wars of the Roses had so thoroughly devastated the old nobility that Henry VII faced fewer restraints on royal authority than any English king since the Norman conquest. This enhanced royal power, combined with Henry's administrative reforms and financial acumen, laid the foundations for the Tudor absolutism that would characterize 16th century English monarchy. Bosworth Field's place in English historical memory was carefully cultivated by Tudor propaganda, which portrayed the battle as a cosmic struggle between good and evil, rather than a mere dynastic dispute. William Shakespeare's dramatic portrayal of Richard III as a deformed villain and Henry VII as a saviour sent by Providence established a narrative that dominated popular understanding for centuries, even though modern scholarship has revealed a more complex reality. The rediscovery of Richard III's remains in 2012, buried beneath a Leicester car park, brought renewed attention to Bosworth and the Wars of the Roses generally. The analysis of Richard's skeleton, showing numerous battle wounds consistent with contemporary accounts of his death, provided physical evidence for the traditional narrative, while also revealing details about medieval warfare and the king's final moments that historical records had obscured. The marriage of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York on January 18, 1486, represented far more than a simple dynastic alliance. It was the culmination of 30 years of bloody civil war, the fusion of rival houses that had torn England apart, and the creation of a new dynasty that would rule England for over a century. This union, born from the ashes of the Wars of the Roses, transformed bitter enemies into a single family and offered England the prospect of peace and stability that had been absent since the golden days of Henry V Elizabeth, later known as Elizabeth of York, had endured extraordinary trials during her 20 years of life before becoming Henry Tudor's queen. Born in 1466 as the eldest daughter of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, she had experienced the heights of Yorkist triumph and the depths of dynastic tragedy. Her childhood had been marked by the chaos of Warwick's rebellion and the brief Lancastrian restoration, while her adolescence witnessed her father's death, her brother's disappearance, her uncle's usurpation, and her family's complete destruction. The transformation of Elizabeth from Yorkist princess to Lancastrian queen required both personal courage and political sophistication, as she navigated the dangerous transition from enemy to ally of the man who had defeated and killed her uncle. Her marriage to Henry represented not personal choice but political necessity, yet the couple appears to have developed genuine affection over time, creating a partnership that combined political utility with personal compatibility. Henry's delay in marrying Elizabeth for 5 months after Bosworth, despite having promised this union before the battle, demonstrated his political acumen and his determination to establish his own legitimacy independent of his wife's superior hereditary claim. By first securing his coronation and parliamentary recognition, Henry ensured that he ruled as king in his own right, rather than as Elizabeth's consort, a crucial distinction that prevented Yorkist supporters from claiming that the true monarch was the Queen, rather than the king. The wedding ceremony itself was deliberately magnificent, designed to demonstrate both the legitimacy of the union and the prosperity of the new regime. Held at Westminster Abbey with full traditional ceremony, the marriage brought together nobles from both former factions, Lancastrian and Yorkist, requiring them to witness and celebrate the union that officially ended their conflict. The presence of former enemies side by side in the abbey symbolized the reconciliation that Henry hoped to achieve throughout his kingdom. The creation of the Tudor rose, combining the white rose of York with the red rose of Lancaster, provided a powerful visual symbol of the dynastic union and the end of civil war. This heraldic device appeared everywhere in Tudor propaganda, on coins, in paintings, carved into buildings, woven into tapestries, serving as a constant reminder that the Wars of the Roses had ended through marriage, rather than continued bloodshed. The Tudor rose became perhaps the most successful piece of political branding in English history, its message of unity and reconciliation resonating across centuries. Elizabeth's coronation as Queen in November 1487 provided another opportunity to demonstrate the unity of the Tudor regime and the respect accorded to her Yorkist heritage. The delay in her coronation, caused by pregnancy and the Simnel Rebellion, actually enhanced its significance when it finally occurred, as Elizabeth's safe delivery of Prince Arthur demonstrated the fertility of the Tudor union, while the defeat of Simnel showed that Yorkist resistance was futile. The birth of Arthur Tudor in September 1486, less than 8 months after the royal wedding, secured the Tudor succession and demonstrated that the marriage was producing the heirs necessary for dynastic stability. The choice of name deliberately invoked legendary British kingship, suggesting that the Tudor dynasty represented a return to ancient British greatness and the fulfillment of prophecies about Arthur's return. The infant prince's birth at Winchester, traditionally identified with Camelot, reinforced these associations. Arthur's christening ceremony brought together the great nobles of England in a celebration that emphasized unity and continuity. The choice of godparents carefully balanced former Lancastrian and Yorkist supporters, demonstrating Henry's commitment to healing the divisions of the past. The Earl of Oxford, Henry's loyal Lancastrian supporter, served alongside Elizabeth Woodville, the Yorkist Queen Dowager, symbolizing the reconciliation that Arthur's birth represented. The couple's subsequent children, Margaret, Henry, and Mary, provided additional security for the succession and demonstrated the continuing fertility of the Tudor union. Each birth was celebrated with appropriate ceremony, while also serving political purposes, as Margaret's eventual marriage to James IV of Scotland would unite the Scottish and English crowns, while Mary's marriages would provide important foreign alliances. Elizabeth's role as Queen Consort demonstrated her understanding of the complex political position she occupied, as she carefully balanced her Yorkist heritage with loyalty to her Lancastrian husband. She maintained dignity and grace in her public role, while avoiding any suggestion that she might serve as a focus for Yorkist resistance. Her success in navigating these dangerous waters helped establish the Tudor regime's legitimacy and demonstrated that former enemies could indeed find common ground. The relationship between Henry and Elizabeth appears to have evolved from political arrangement to genuine partnership, with contemporary accounts suggesting real affection between the couple. While Henry's suspicious nature and focus on security sometimes created tensions, Elizabeth's patience and political intelligence helped maintain harmony within the royal family. Their correspondence, limited though it is, suggests mutual respect and shared commitment to their children's welfare and the dynasty's success. Elizabeth's influence on Henry's policies was necessarily subtle, operating through informal channels rather than formal authority, but evidence suggests she played a significant role in moderating some of her husband's harsher impulses. Her advocacy for mercy towards certain Yorkist sympathizers and her efforts to reconcile former enemies helped create the atmosphere of reconciliation that characterized much of Henry VII's reign. The Queen's maintenance of certain Yorkist traditions and her patronage of individuals associated with her father's reign helped ease the transition from Yorkist to Tudor rule. By honouring her father's memory while accepting her husband's authority, Elizabeth modelled the kind of reconciliation that Henry needed from his former enemies. Her example encouraged other Yorkists to accept Tudor rule and find their place in the new political order. The tragic death of Prince Arthur in 1502 represented a devastating blow to both parents and to the dynasty they had created, as the heir who embodied the union of Lancaster and York was suddenly gone. Elizabeth's grief was compounded by the knowledge that the succession now depended on her younger son Henry, who had been prepared for a church career rather than kingship. The loss demonstrated that even the most carefully constructed dynastic plans remained vulnerable to fate's cruel interventions. Elizabeth's own death in 1503, following complications from childbirth, left Henry VII a widower and deprived the Tudor regime of a unifying figure who had helped bridge the divide between former enemies. Her funeral was marked by genuine grief from both former Lancastrians and Yorkists, testimony to a success in embodying the reconciliation that the Tudor rose symbolized. The elaborate tomb she would eventually share with Henry in Westminster Abbey's Lady Chapel stands as a monument to the partnership that ended the Wars of the Roses. The legacy of Henry and Elizabeth's union extended far beyond their personal relationship to fundamentally transform English political culture. Their marriage demonstrated that dynastic conflicts could be resolved through alliance rather than extermination, offering a model for peaceful resolution of succession disputes. The Tudor dynasty they founded would rule England for 118 years, bringing relative stability, cultural flourishing, and international prominence to a kingdom that had been torn apart by civil war. Their descendant, Elizabeth I, would later invoke her grandfather Henry VII and her grandmother Elizabeth of York as models of successful monarchy, while the Stuart succession would come through Henry and Elizabeth's daughter, Margaret. The union of the Roses thus had implications that extended centuries beyond the couple's own lifetimes, shaping English and British history in ways that neither could have fully anticipated. The marriage of Henry and Elizabeth represented the triumph of pragmatic politics over ideological purity, demonstrating that former enemies could find common ground when the alternative was continued bloodshed. Their willingness to put aside partisan loyalties in favour of national unity offered England a path forward from the destructive cycle of revenge that had characterized the Wars of the Roses. In this sense, their union represented not just the end of one historical period, but the beginning of another. As medieval England gave way to the early modern state, the Tudor rose that symbolized their marriage became a promise that England would never again tear itself apart in dynastic civil war. While this promise would be tested by subsequent succession crises, the memory of the Wars of the Roses and the reconciliation achieved by Henry and Elizabeth would serve as a powerful argument for unity and compromise. The roses that had bloomed red and white with blood and tears were finally united, offering hope that love and alliance could indeed conquer the hatred and violence that had plagued England for a generation. And so, dear sleepy listener, our long journey through England's bloodiest family war comes to its peaceful end. We have travelled together through 30 years of passion, betrayal, courage, and tragedy, witnessing how the roses of York and Lancaster, white and red, bloomed across England's fields in blood, before finally uniting in the Tudor rose of reconciliation and hope. From the tragic madness of Henry VI to the fierce determination of Margaret of Anjou, from the ambitions of Richard Duke of York to the triumph of his son Edward IV, from the controversial reign of Richard III to the ultimate victory of Henry Tudor, we have seen how personal choices and political necessities intertwine to create one of history's most dramatic and consequential conflicts. The Wars of the Roses transformed England in ways that extended far beyond the immediate question of which family would wear the crown. The old nobility was decimated, royal authority was enhanced, and the medieval world began its transformation into the early modern state. The lessons learned in those bloody decades about the dangers of weak kingship, the importance of clear succession, and the need for reconciliation after conflict would shape English political culture for centuries to come. Most beautifully of all, we have witnessed how love ultimately triumphed over hatred, as Henry Tudor and Elizabeth of York chose alliance over vengeance, creating through their marriage a dynasty that would bring stability and prosperity to a kingdom exhausted by war. Their union proved that even the bitterest enemies could find common ground, that cycles of revenge could be broken, and that hope could emerge from the darkest tragedies. The White Rose of York and the Red Rose of Lancaster, once symbols of bitter division and deadly rivalry, became forever united in the Tudor Rose. A beautiful reminder that even the bloodiest conflicts can end in love and reconciliation, that forgiveness is possible even after terrible crimes, and that the future need not be bound by the hatreds of the past. I hope this tale has carried you gently toward the most restful sleep, dear listener. The story of the Wars of the Roses reminds us that even in our darkest moments, redemption is possible, that courage and love can overcome hatred and fear, and that from the ashes of conflict, new hope can bloom. Before you drift completely away into dreams, I would be absolutely delighted if you could share your thoughts in the comments below. Which figure from this epic story touched your heart most deeply? Was it the warrior queen Margaret fighting for her son's inheritance? The tragic young princes lost to history? The triumphant Edward IV? Or perhaps Henry and Elizabeth, whose love united a divided kingdom? Your comments truly brighten my day and help me understand what resonates most with wonderful viewers like yourself. And if you've enjoyed this journey through history, a gentle like would mean the world to me, while subscribing to Sleepy Crown ensures you'll never miss another soothing historical tale. Your support helps me continue bringing these peaceful stories to dreamers everywhere, creating our growing family of history lovers who find comfort in the gentle whispers of the past. Sweet dreams, dear listener. May the gentle whispers of medieval England guide you to the most peaceful slumber, and may you wake refreshed, remembering that even the longest wars can end in peace, even the deepest hatreds can transform into love, and even the darkest nights eventually give way to dawn. Sleep well, dear friend. Until we meet again in another tale from history's treasure chest, the Wars of the Roses are over. Peace has been restored, and now it is time for you to rest. Good night.